Good evening. I'd like to call to order the October 23rd meeting of the Falmouth Planning Board. The first thing on our agenda tonight is the minutes from October 9th and October 16th.
Mr. Chairman, I recommend approval of the minutes of October 9th, 2018, and October 16th, 2018, as correct.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? No. The next item on the agenda is public comment. Now, this is for things that are not on our agenda tonight, and we'll allow anyone to come up for a couple minutes and discuss anything on their mind, and we'll take it into consideration for future agendas. Mr. Walker, you have told us you were coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I would like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for all the time you so generously gave me to help me understand a number of things that the planning board is working on. I'd also like to thank Mr. Bott for the time that he gave me and the information that he provided. I sent to you, the members of the planning board, a letter, an email letter through Mr. Bott. I'll just briefly summarize that, if I may. 3 points. With regard to Planning Board Article 7 for the town meeting coming up, I am asking and recommending that in addition to the regulation and control of solar energy systems, that there be some explicit encouragement in the wording of the bylaw. Wording such as, encouraging wording such as solar energy systems may be exempt from lot coverage and setback restrictions and other kinds of wording that is in the message that I sent you. With regard to Planning Board Article number 8, I ask and recommend that you split that into 2 articles. As I said when you had your public hearing on the matter, 2 articles, one which will establish the overlay ground-mounted, large-scale ground-mounted solar overlay district in principle. A second article which will apply that overlay district principle specifically to that blacksmith shop corridor. And the reason, at least one of the reasons that I recommend that is that in Planning Board Article number 8, the setback distances are much greater than in the model bylaw of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so I'm worried that those dimensions, those distances might not be appropriate for every area that we come upon in the town of Falmouth for such an overlay district. So separate the article into 2. I think it's a great article, a great idea. I like to see it separated into 2. Finally, point number 3, Planning Board Article number 11. I don't think that is necessary. I hope that you will consider withdrawing that from the warrant. I think that you and others in the community and in the town government structure, especially perhaps the Energy Committee, I hope, I think that all of you and all of us can engage right away in discussing the issues, and we don't need a moratorium. So I hope you withdraw that. I don't think it's necessary. I think it'll send the wrong message. I explain my rationale for that recommendation in my letter to you. And I thank you again for letting me speak.
Thank you. Anyone else on a non-agenda item? Hearing none, we'll move on. The next is the joint meeting with Cape Cod Commission, Community Resilience by Design, a creative approach to moderate density. Is that you, Heather, or who's leading this?
So thank you very much for the opportunity to return. If you recall, we met with you back in June, and we convened a first session, really taking a step back with the town of Falmouth and our other partner communities we're working with Orleans, and Eastham as well. And the genesis of the project really is based in long-range planning and planning for housing supply. We know that as a nation and as a region, we've really stepped back from planning for housing supply and planning for infrastructure and utilities at the same time as we plan for housing. And this is an opportunity for us to think about those things together and to think about what our community goals are for meeting long-range housing supply to meet the needs of all life stages and lifestyles on Cape Cod. Falmouth has been a great partner in this exercise, and it's a nice opportunity for you to think really long-term. We know just from the last presenter's comments how often you focus on all of the details of the implementation of your existing regulations. This project really gives you an opportunity as a community, with the community, and thank you all for being here, to think long-term about what your vision is for a particular planning area. We were lucky enough to bring on Union Studio to think about that with us, and Jeremy Lake is here to revisit where we left you back in June and take us through some of the work that we've been doing on behalf of the town in the last several months. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone. Thanks for having us out again. My name is Jeremy Lake with Union Studio. We are an architecture and planning firm based in Providence, Rhode Island, about 25 folks. And our real mission is to make sure that any project we work on, no matter how big or small, understands the community within which it is a part of and how it can make a civic contribution to that community. Even though we are in Providence, we've done a number of projects on the Cape. Just a couple of examples on the left, South Sandwich Village. This was a newly proposed mixed-use community that we worked on several years ago. Top right, Sandwich Marina study. This was working with the town of Sandwich and Mass Development, coming up with a vision plan for the marina area. The lower right-hand corner was a competition by the Cape Cod Young Professionals Group to design workforce housing. That was a little cottage side hustle house we came up that we proposed. We also have a number of built projects or projects in the works on the Cape. The top left, Heritage Sands, which is a cottage community in Dennisport, Massachusetts. Top right, Brewster's Landing is a 40B project, so affordable and market rate housing out on Brewster, Massachusetts. And on the bottom image, the plan and the image that you see there, Sea Captain's Row in Hyannis. That's going to be workforce housing out in Hyannis. So again, we aren't Cape based, but we certainly spend a lot of time out of the Cape and are glad to continue spending time out on the Cape. As a quick outline for tonight, first I thought I would recap our first presentation, and I thought maybe I would get a show of hands of who all was here for the first presentation. It won't hurt my feeling if you weren't. I'm just trying to understand. Okay, that's actually pretty helpful. So I think I won't belabor that. I'm not going to do the first presentation all over again, but I certainly want to recap particularly the major issues so you understand what it is we were trying to achieve. Tonight is actually the second presentation where we're basically presenting the proposed sort of strategies or results of the efforts that we've been doing for the last few months. I'll then talk about the input we got in the first public sessions. One of the things I forgot to mention at this top was that we are working, well, actually I'll get to that. I'll keep going. We're going to talk about the input we got from those first public presentations. We also had an online visual preference survey. We got something like 450 responses, which is great, so I'll share with you the input we got from that. We'll talk through the proposed building types, which is really the core of our deliverable. And then we wanted to go through a few illustrative case studies to show you how those building types could be applied or arrayed in the various communities we've been working with. And then we'll conclude with some next steps and a little bit of time for discussion, although I know you guys have a pretty full agenda tonight. So a quick recap of the first public presentation. Why are we here? We're here because we wanted to start a series of community conversations around the need for addressing the housing crisis that we have out on the Cape. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. But in particular, what we wanted to make sure we were doing was getting input from the community. We didn't want to kind of show up with our own lens, our own ideas of what it was, without trying to talk to the community to figure out what are some appropriate strategies that folks would feel like actually belong or fit in and enhance the communities that we are working within. In terms of our process and schedule, we began back in May with our preliminary work. Our first public presentations were back in June. We had intended to do an online visual preference survey in July and August. We gave ourselves a little more time there because we wanted to make sure it was the best online survey it could be. We presented at the One Cape Summit in August, shared sort of the process we were going, some of our preliminary thoughts there. And here we are doing the second public presentations. Again, originally we thought we'd been doing those in September, but here we are in October. We're going to also be doing this in Eastham and Orleans in November. Our last step is developing a framework for form-based regulation. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's sort of our next and final step for our process. But we are also looking to expand and do the same exercise in additional communities. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. Where we are starting, as I mentioned, the three communities, Falmouth, Eastham, and Orleans. Why those three? Well, those are three communities that have recently gone through some sort of studies that identified places where some new moderate density housing types might be appropriate. And in fact, two of the three also have undergone recent zoning changes, not Falmouth, but the other two, that try to promote some more of this this moderate density housing typologies. And these are the specific areas within those three communities that we are here to talk about. So Falmouth, where we are, here on the right, that's the Davis Straits area. So that's where the Christmas tree shops are, and the Starbucks. And there were similar areas identified in Orleans and Eastham as well. And these are really the areas that are transitional areas. These are primarily main streets with commercial uses along them. But you can see just outside of the lines, actually I think I can wiggle this a little bit, there we go. Just past the line of that higher intensity commercial use, you pretty much immediately get into a single family residential adjacency. And there's nothing that really transitions from that more intensive use to that less intensive use. So all three of these areas shared that same set of challenges and opportunities. So what are we hoping to deliver? First and foremost are a number of moderate density housing prototypes. That's what we'll be talking about here tonight. As I mentioned, we're also going to develop these into a form-based regulation framework. And we also intended to share our findings both through the One Cape Summit and also these presentations with the public. So the housing challenge on Cape Cod, again, I'm not going to go through this in great detail because we did last time, but this was a study that was put out last year by the Cape Cod Commission and a number of partners. It's an excellent study, a very easy read. I recommend folks taking a look into it if you're interested in these types of issues. The key takeaways are that population is growing, about 6,000 more people by 2025, which, by the way, is only a few years away, right? Housing prices and rents are increasing by rates at a much higher rate than the owner incomes and renter incomes are, so the cost of living is just getting exponentially more challenging. And the majority of the housing stock on Cape Cod is single-family homes, 82%. That's extremely high. Most of the nation, that number's usually around 60%. So what that suggests is if your lifestyle doesn't need a single-family house, you have a very difficult time finding something that will meet your housing need, and there's not a lot of diversity of housing choice. So what is all this beginning to suggest? If we want to try to resolve some of those challenges of the housing crisis, it's beginning to suggest we might need to consider some sort of density, the dreaded D word, right? But what really we are here to talk about is that not all density is the same. There might be various options that might feel more appropriate for the communities that we're talking about here. And just, again, most of you probably know, but when we're talking about density, at the most basic level, it's a mathematical exercise of how many units are there within a single acre of land. So if you have one house on 1 acre, that's 1 unit to the acre, all the way up to the example on the right, let's say there's 18 units in that same acre of land, that's 18 units to the acre. So density at its core is really a simple mathematical equation, but it's really so much more than that. And we shared this example of a project we had in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, where on the left you have what the by right zoning was looking for, which was multifamily housing, and that building had 14 units in it and 3/4 of an acre of land. But what you can begin to see from around the edges is it wasn't really appropriate for that specific context. You've got a single family house on either side of it across the street. This is right at the transition off of Main Street, so it was the appropriate location to have some sort of transitional density. But that form is something that got most folks sort of upset if you were to come in and propose that. So what we proposed and built instead is what you see on the right. We took that same number of units, broke it down into a number of cottages. So again, you have 15 cottages on 3/4 of an acre, so that's 20 units to the acre. Again, from a mathematical standpoint, that sounds very high, but you can see from the image down below, the character of that and the scale of that was something that felt more appropriate to that single-family residential context. In our last meeting, we then went through an extra series of these side-by-side comparisons as sort of a test. We didn't give the answers right away, but we were trying to get folks' sense of, what is density, which one has a higher density. So in the top left, for example, the building on the left is actually a little 5-unit building that looks very much like a single-family home. So you compare that to a typical single-family home, say on a 1/4 acre or 1/2 acre lot, and that first building is getting 10 units to the acre versus the single family, which are only getting 2 to 4 units to the acre. So it's getting, 2 to 3 times the density in a form that's very familiar and is appropriate for that kind of a context or setting. And then we went through a number of other examples to show, bottom left was that same building compared to a number of townhouses. They have the same density, 10 units to the acre. The top right was showing that just because they're both duplexes, you might get differing results. So one was 5 units to the acre, one was 8. And on the bottom right was an example where, you would probably think that the larger multifamily complex would come in with a higher density. But in reality, the bottom right, which is actually literally right around the corner over here, a series of these small stacked flats, because they're super efficient, don't take up a lot of land, those actually came in at a higher density than what we would intuitively think would be the thing that would have the higher density. So it can be, it's really more important about the form than it is the numerical number here. So what are some creative approaches? We introduced this idea of the missing middle. A lot of the housing that we've built in the last 60 years has either been single family on the left or multifamily on the right, the sort of larger low-rise multifamily building typology. And there's really all of these building types in between those that we used to build that we haven't been building in the last 60 years. And we think that that's a good starting point for what we might consider here. On the Cape, our context that we talked about, it's going from single family directly to commercial, right? So the right-hand side of this, think of that as a commercial property. So what are those things that might slot in between those as a transitional solution? So these types were common pre-1940s. They provided higher density types that could plug in pretty neatly into a single family sort of context. So you can see here the colored ones are the moderate density types slotted in between the single family homes, and they fit. You squint your eye as you walk by, you would never pick up on it. Why is the missing middle missing? A number of reasons, but primarily we're zoning ordinances coming out of World War II. We tried to simplify zoning down to a couple of very simple categories: single-family housing, multifamily housing, retail, right? So we split everything up, and as a result, we kind of left this big gap of all these great options. As a result, the financing structures followed suit, and because we haven't done these things for 60 years, we also find there's usually a lot of localized resistance to these, higher density types, higher than single-family. So there's a renewed interest now because they slot in nicely in historic cores, which is where a lot of either empty nesters or millennials, it's funny, they're all looking for the same stuff. They want to be in these kind of happening historic cores where there's a limited amount of land. So these are good solutions for getting a couple of units in the limited space that's left. They also provide more affordable options. If you can put more units on the same land, obviously you can spread that land cost out. So it's an affordable housing alternative. The industry in general is looking for smaller increments. The big 400-unit project that takes 10 years, people are less interested in trying to do that. The banks don't want to finance it. The developers are worried about how long they've got their neck stuck out on it. So everybody is looking for a smaller increment of development, and these help do that. And generally speaking, I think people are beginning to appreciate this notion of finding a home that's the right size. Home sizes have been ballooning for 50, 60 years, and these are alternatives where they are right size, the correct size for a number of people's lifestyles, not everyone's. So what do we mean by building types? And this is where we introduce this idea that when we talk about building type, it's a way of categorizing housing types that have a similar disposition. So for instance, you probably all can picture a cottage, right? That's a very small scale single family home. When 2 single families are attached to a duplex, a series of them are attached to a townhouse. Most people are pretty aware of those. A couple of the other types we talked about, stacked flats, which is really like a couple of small apartments that are connected but still in a relatively small form. Towns over flat is this idea that you could have a single multi-story unit over a flat below. And the last one is a multiplex, which was really, it's a very small multifamily building. So say only 10 to 12 units, not a large multifamily complex that might have 60, 70 units in a single building. So these were the initial types we shared in the first presentation. And we went through each of these, which I'm not going to do, and we talked about some of the particular characteristics of that type. We would show some examples that we found on the Cape that helped us calibrate what the usual density was for their application currently on the Cape. We showed some precedent images because not all of those were necessarily wonderful to look at in their current form. A lot of them were built in the 60s, and so they look a little tired. And in the lower right, we did what we call a visual preference, where we showed 2 images and we talked with folks that were at the first presentation, which one of these feels more appropriate. And we had some really good conversations around issues of style and scale, and I'll relay those results in a moment. We talked a little bit about form-based codes, which I won't go into great detail here, but the notion of a form-based regulation it's an alternate form of zoning, where zoning currently is generally more about sort of metrics, dimensional issues, and uses. And the idea with a form-based code is to say, well, I'm less concerned about what the use is in there as long as the building is of a certain disposition that would fit into the existing context. So say you're on a street that's largely 3-story grand single-family houses. If you're proposing something new there, maybe it's more important that it looks like it fits as a single-family house, even if it's actually a Starbucks with 3 units above it. So it's another way of thinking about zoning that tries to get more to the core of the character of the building and less about the use or the particular metrics that might be typically associated with it. So that's a big, complicated, that's probably its own lecture, but that's as much as we'll talk about it tonight. So we concluded the first one saying, so circling back, really our ultimate question was, in each of these specific contexts, in Falmouth, Orleans, and Eastham, could any or all of these options fit into your community? So that's where we sort of left off in the last one. We had conversations around that. And so to transition into the input from those first presentations, these were the takeaways we took from the conversations we had at that first presentation. So when talking about style, generally speaking, the folks we were talking to in Falmouth trended towards more traditional looking architecture. Folks in Eastham trended towards more contemporary looking architecture. And folks in Orleans were pretty flexible. They were kind of, the Orleans area is actually a fairly sizable area. So I think they were of the mindset that, well, there's probably a corner in here that works for any particular style. Similarly with scale, participants in Falmouth were generally more accepting of larger scale structures, again, in the Davis Straits area. If it was right up on, Davis Straits, maybe 4 stories, even 4 stories would be acceptable. The inverse of that, Eastham folks were very nervous when you got over about 2 stories in height. So the existing context there is much lower, so that makes some sense. And folks in Orleans were relatively flexible when it came to scale. It was more a question of, well, it depends where you are. If you're right on the main drag, something larger probably makes some sense. When you're getting out to the edges where it's transitioning back to the single family, that's when we would probably expect something a little bit lower scale. And we agree with that notion in all 3 of these locations. And I think by the end of that conversation, generally folks were in agreement that density, really it's more of a matter of having good design, contextual design that fits, more so than it is thinking about whatever the literal numerical density is. So following that meeting, we did the online visual preference survey. And so these are the results through October 11th. I believe, is it still open or have we closed it at this point? It should be closed at this point. Okay. Again, we got 450 some responses, which was really great. There were 2 issues that we wanted to try to address in the visual preference survey. The first was scale. And so the way we arranged this was we tried to show a series of images that went from their sort of shortest form on the left up to their tallest form on the right, and then looked at them in terms of single-family types, townhouse types, and multifamily types. We didn't get into this level of detail with the survey. This was what our thinking was. So on the single family, for instance, we went anywhere from 1 story up to 2.5 stories. The townhouses from 1.5 stories up to 3 stories. The multifamily anywhere from sort of 2.5 up to 3.5. And we were just asking folks pretty simply, do you think a building of this scale would be a good fit within the study area? And their options were to say it was definitely a good fit, could be a good fit, probably not a good fit, or definitely not a good fit. And we tracked this between the respondents from the 3 different communities and then looked at the answers overall as well. So the hope was that this was sort of testing the thesis of the results we got from those first presentations, which were a much smaller group of folks, right? So this was expanding it to a much larger audience. And right off the bat, you begin to see something interesting between the 3 different communities. That first image, the 1-story cottage in those transitional core sort of study areas. In Falmouth, the response we got was something that small of a scale is probably not a good fit. That's sort of a missed opportunity if all we're doing is building 1-story cottages. But you can see by the time you talk to the folks in Eastham, they were actually feeling pretty good about the 1-story scale, right? Because again, different context, that makes sense. I think this was what we were hoping we would see. Overall, it looked like most folks were generally comfortable with it being a good fit, see that 32%, but maybe going a little bit below there. So, yeah, it's kind of working. This isn't so bad. The next image, when we get up to 1.5 stories, you can see now we're beginning to get a lot of consensus between all the communities. This could be a good fit. And so, in any of these places, something at about 1.5 stories could feel pretty good. As we go up, you can see the results are beginning to trend a little bit the other ways. But at 2 stories, again, generally folks thought it could be a good fit, although in Eastham, we're starting to get them a little bit nervous. At 2.5 stories, you can see it's stepping down again even further. So in Eastham, we've definitely crossed a threshold where they're not quite so comfortable But in Falmouth or in Orleans, generally speaking, folks are feeling pretty good. Now, we don't have 100% on any one of those, right? There's always a sliding scale there, but we were trying to highlight the general trends that we were seeing in here. So generally speaking, these single-family homes at the smallest scale were supporting the trends that we thought we were going to hear, which was helpful. So to go, and then we also had an option where we would show all four, and you could pick which combination of these do you think felt good in the study area. Some people would choose 1, some people would choose 3. In this first instance, the average was 2.12 types per person taking the survey. So people were generally thinking about 2 or 3 of these in combination, which was great, because that's kind of what we were thinking about. And again, you can kind of see the bias is the wrong word, but the tendency for Eastham folks to be thinking a little bit lower in scale compared to what we were talking about in Falmouth and Orleans. So that was at the single family scale. And I'll try to go through the rest of these quickly so we don't belabor this point. Townhouses at 1.5 story, feeling pretty good about it. When we get to 2 stories, still feeling pretty good about it. When we get up to 2.5 stories, you can see in Eastham, we lost them. Oh, got too big for Eastham, right? But in Falmouth and Orleans, you get kind of a mixed result there. You can kind of see it's pretty evenly spread, 25, 27, 33, but generally starting to get a little bit nervous about this at 2.5. And certainly by the time we got up to 3 stories, across the board, folks were generally kind of feeling like, again, that feels a little bit too big for what we're used to out here on the Cape. And as you'd imagine, when we showed them a combination, they were generally leaning towards the lower scale stuff. But look at the average, an average of 1.77 types per survey. So now folks are saying, okay, 1, maybe 2 of these is feeling okay, but I don't know about that 3rd and 4th one. Lastly, at the largest scale buildings, right off the bat, you can see Falmouth, Orleans feeling okay about this first image. Right away, Eastham, forget it. You went too big already. So anything pretty much over 2.5 stories in Eastham, you'll see they were like, forget it. You've gone too far. Getting up to 2.5, even 3 stories in this structure. Again, you can see sort of mixed results, but still probably okay in Falmouth and Orleans. By the time we got to a full 3 or even 3.5, you can see, again, folks are generally getting pretty worried at this point that maybe we've gone too far, maybe we've gotten a little too big. That's not to say that these sorts of things aren't ultimately appropriate in these study areas. I would still argue if we could have a conversation around where in the study area you were talking about, right up on the main corridor, I think people could get their heads around it being a taller scale. At the edges, certainly, you wouldn't conceive of 3 or 3.5 stories right up adjacent to the single-family homes that are right next door. But again, we weren't getting sort of that into the weeds with these things because you couldn't. That needs to be a conversation. So again, folks generally leaning towards the sort of middle scale, the 2.5 story. Again, look at the number of responses, 1.23. So at this point, almost everyone's probably just choosing the first one. Some folks are maybe choosing the second one. So that's what we learned about scale. The other issue was style. So we took a similar approach. There was a sliding scale instead of shortest to tallest. Now we were talking about sort of a more traditional versus a more contemporary in terms of the flavor of the building. And again, thinking of it in terms of single-family, townhouse, and multifamily types. In the scale one, we kind of showed those together, so you could kind of intuitively see that we were trying to give you a sliding scale. In this one, we scrambled these all over the place so that people couldn't necessarily pick up on that because we were thinking that might be better for trying to get an unbiased response. And as a reminder, in our first meetings, what we heard was Falmouth leans more traditional, Eastham leans more contemporary. So let's see what this told us. Right off the bat, when we were looking at the smallest scale, obviously you guys all can recognize that's Martha's Vineyard up there. Folks in Eastham love Martha's Vineyard style stuff, right? In Falmouth, we actually get a bit of a split vote, which I thought was interesting, and I'm guessing that's because it is so obviously Martha's Vineyard that you might say, this isn't Martha's Vineyard, right? This is Falmouth. So I'm guessing that's a little bit of what that's about. When you get to this next level, which is really sort of a very simply detailed traditional sort of architecture, this is kind of what we live and breathe at our practice. But you can see that's generally a pretty good fit. Most people are pretty comfortable with something that looks very much like a Cape-style architecture. As we got a little bit more contemporary, this is the one place that it did support that idea. You can see in Eastham, they were actually pretty supportive of this, what I would call a transitional style. It's sort of traditional forms, but with a little bit more sort of contemporary detailing. Falmouth kind of really starting to lean a little bit away from that, Orleans somewhere in the middle. So again, this is really supporting those initial conversations we had. And then last but not least, the sort of most contemporary version. Now we've kind of lost people, although you can see if there was one place it was going to be supported, it's in Eastham. So again, at the smallest scale of images, it's supporting the conversations we had. And I think what's going to get interesting is now as we start to go up the ladder in terms of the scale of the buildings, again, we were hoping people would focus on the style, but you'll see, I think some people couldn't focus on the style once the building started to get a little bit bigger. So townhouses, the most traditional form, again, a fairly split vote in Falmouth, comfortable with it, generally speaking in Orleans, Eastham, not so much. This sort of middle, and again, 3-story building, right? So are the Eastham folks responding to the style or the scale? This next ratchet up, you know, the sort of tried and true Cape look, right? Everybody's pretty comfortable with that. As we get a little bit more contemporary, again, you can see we're slowly sliding down to the point when we've gone on a trip to San Francisco, you know, forget it, we're out of here, no thank you. And last but not least, in the biggest scale structure, again, most traditional looking building, we're already, you know, way down on the scale for a lot of folks, which again, I think has more to do with the scale than the style. I think people were having a hard time divorcing that notion. Same thing here, although again in Falmouth, you know, this would be a great fit. Everybody, you know, sees that kind of look as being something that works pretty well. Sliding down with Eastham. And again, as it gets more and more contemporary, by the time we're here, everybody's like, forget it, you know, not interested. I don't blame them. So again, just the key takeaways from what we just said. When we're talking about scale in Eastham, it seems like the range was like 1 to 2 stories is where people were feeling pretty good. When you talk about Falmouth or Orleans, we're really sliding up a little bit on the scale. Maybe 1.5 to 2.5 stories is what most people were comfortable with. And in general, everybody was getting a little bit uncomfortable when you got to that 3 stories or above 3 stories. So that's great. That's what we were kind of expecting to hear. As it relates to style in all 3 communities, you could see there was generally a trend towards being more supportive of more traditional styles than more contemporary styles. And at first, we saw that trend with Eastham of being supportive of the contemporary, more contemporary look. But as soon as the scale went up, they couldn't get past seeing it any other way, right? So the scale bias kind of set in. And it's kind of unfortunate that we actually didn't have smaller scale images to try to get more of that pattern and trend shown. But whereas in Falmouth and Orleans, they actually, if you go back and look at the percentages, Falmouth and Orleans voted pretty similarly all the way through. Again, generally pretty comfortable with anything sort of in the middle, but let's not, you know, go too crazy on the edges. So that was the input we got from the visual preference survey, which was great. And I don't think I'm just going to go back to remind myself yet. It tapered off as it went down, but we had a total of 420 to 450 overall. About 100 in Eastham, about 75 in Orleans, Falmouth 227, 230. I don't know what that was. So thank you, Falmouth, for your participation. So proposed building types. So again, this is what we were ultimately asked to deliver on, was looking at what the options could be for delivering moderate density housing types that could work on the Cape, particularly in these types of locations, to achieve more housing choice at a higher density. So you'll recall we talked about the cottage, duplex, townhouse, towns over flat, stack flats, and multiplex when we came in at first. And these are the types that we've actually developed and wanted to talk about tonight. So across the top, you can see cottage, duplex, townhouse, as we were discussing. When we got into the larger density types, we had slightly different thoughts. They were related, but slightly different. So, for instance, that notion of a town over flat, where it was maybe a 2-story unit over a 1-story unit, we began to realize, well, what's to keep you from doing this as a 2-story building and doing just 1 unit over 1 unit, and calling that a double-decker? I know that's a term, I think in Boston they talk about double-decker, or they might call them 2 families. There's triple-deckers when you stack 3 units. Those are harder to do now with code. But so we decided to kind of relabel that as a double-decker because we thought that was a little more intuitive. What we were calling stacked flats, we began to realize that wasn't particularly descriptive. Pretty much any apartment building is a bunch of flat units stacked. And what we realized is what we were really trying to get after was a building form that really looked like a large single-family house. That's what was important. And the fact that there's 4 to 6 units in it is a little bit less important. It's more about sort of getting across that message so that it really could slot in a number of contexts. And so we decided to call that a manor house. And last but not least, the 10 to 12 unit multifamily building, again, a smaller multifamily building. Multiplex sounded a little bit too much like a movie theater. So we thought we would call those walk-ups, because I think that's another term that people have some familiarity with. If you're certainly in Providence, a small apartment building, people would say, oh, I live in a walk-up. It obviously suggests that you go up a flight of steps in your home. Maybe there's an elevator, maybe not. But again, we were just trying to find terminology to describe these 6 variations that we wanted to propose for here. To go through each of these, again, I'll try to go through these relatively quickly. We don't want to take all night. But the cottage, typically 1 to 2 stories. They may be attached, which is to say you can put two cottages together and make a duplex, or you can put more together. But typically they're independent. And the density on these is really achieved by clustering them. So I'll show you what we mean by that. But putting one of these on a 1 acre lot, obviously you're not getting any higher density. It's still 1 unit to the acre. So it's the fact that these are a small enough increment in scale that you can cluster them. And what we mean by clustering is, as you can see here, so this is our Heritage Sands project in Dennisport. And you can see the cottages are sort of clustered around a little green space. They each have their own little shared, it's a shared sort of driveway, but they each have their own space. This is how you get the density, is by really compacting these together. Notice there's, you know, a road that comes through, but not every unit is coming off of the road. So you can really start to compact these together. And I think the example we found on the Cape are usually in that 8 to 15 dwelling units per acre. The example I showed you in East Greenwich, that was 20 units to the acre. That's probably about the upper limit of where those can comfortably go. In terms of a plan diagram, this is pretty straightforward on a cottage, but we did these for each of the types. A 2-story, single-family unit, pretty straightforward. And for all of these, we wanted to show that there's various ways that these could look or be configured. With a cottage, it was pretty straightforward, but we wanted to show, you know, these could come in a number of different styles. They might be more like 2 stories or 1.5 stories. You know, you could make these look different depending on which community you were trying to apply them. You could tune it to the local context. The next one was the duplex. Again, a duplex being a side-by-side, you know, they are single-family units, but they're attached, or what we call semi-detached. So they share a central party wall. Again, on the Cape, these were typically 1 to 2 stories. You could certainly get to 2.5 stories, you know, if you might have a bonus room up in that sort of attic level. And the examples we found of duplexes were generally in the 5 to 10 units to the acre range. Plan diagram, again, pretty straightforward. You know, 2 units that happen to be attached by a party wall in the middle. And again, starting to show, again, this notion of varying looks or scales for differing contexts. So, you know, maybe 1.5 stories on the top all the way down to 2 stories below. The one at the top really does look like 2 cottages put together. You would know that, you know, those are 2 separate units. Whereas you go down, especially on the bottom one, where one of the units actually enters the side, now it's beginning to kind of camouflage itself, almost like it's a single-family house, even though it's 2 units. And again, showing that it could be a variety of different sort of styles. Again, we bias these towards the more traditional, slightly less traditional, but not going to contemporary, again, based on the results that we heard from the visual preference survey. Townhouses, typically 2 to 3 stories. I think you guys all know what townhouses are, single-family units that are attached by a common party wall. These can be designed to look like individual units or like a single larger building. So you could almost squint your eyes and imagine that's a center hall house that just kind of kept growing over time. Whereas those were very much intended to look like a bunch of single units that are attached together. So these can be composed different ways depending on what's appropriate for the location. 6 to 12 units to the acre is what we found on the Cape. Again, I think you can understand what that looks like diagrammatically. Single unit attached to multiple units. You could attach these ad infinitum, right? I mean, you could make a 20-unit long building. I think on the Cape you would find yourself stretching it if you went over 4, maybe 5 of these attached together. And in terms of looks, again, trying to show a range anywhere from 1.5 up to 2 or even 2.5. At the top, the idea of, you know, 3 individual units put together, so you really see those as 3 units versus maybe the one in the middle, which is a single building composition. No right or wrong answer, depends on the setting. Next is the double decker. This is that example that it's quite literally around the corner over here. In this instance, we're showing it as a 1-story flat below. See the 2 doors? So you could either walk into the lower unit, or you could go in the second door and go upstairs and you'd have a 2-story unit up above. Or the example on the right, those were both flats. So in this instance, there was a front door here for the lower unit, and then you could actually go up that stair in the back to get into the upper unit. So each with its own ground floor entry access, if you will. So again, diagrammatically, now we're beginning to show the notion of a blue single-story unit with a single multi-story unit above it. And in terms of different configurations, you can see the 2-story version for, you know, flat over flat, the 3-story version we've just been talking about. Maybe it's rotated, maybe they're combined. It's not to say this has to be a standalone building. So maybe there's a series of these that are attached, and again, wanted to show some that maybe are a little bit more contemporary. So again, it's less about style. You could dress these things any number of ways. The manor house, small scale multifamily that looks like a large home. So again, the ones we found of these were typically 2 to 3 stories. To really make it worthwhile, you almost wanted to get to that half story or that full 3rd story. to pull it off looking like a house, you're kind of limited really to about 4 to 6 units. Any more than that, it's getting to be a little bit too big to be reading as a single-family home. And these come into roughly 10 to 20 units per acre. So again, with each of these, the potential density is slowly going up. In terms of a diagram for this particular one, this one was shown with, what is that, 6 units. So there's a shared central stair there. You get 2 units on each of the 3 floors, so you get six total units in the plan view. And again, showing that maybe it's only 3 of them stacked on the left. On the right is a building very similar to this. These could be attached themselves, so almost like a hybrid between a townhouse or a manor house. This was shown as if they were 2 of the same. Maybe they could look different. Maybe they would stagger. Again, there's any number of ways of configuring these, but that's the point, right? That there's some core typologies here, but you can configure them a number of different ways depending on the particular context. And actually, the one on the top right, it's shown as 2.5, but you could also imagine maybe it's only 2 stories. Maybe it's 4 units. It's 2 units down below and 2 units up above. Last but not least, the walk-up, which is a mid-scale multifamily building with a single circulation core. Again, typically 2 to 3 stories, typically 8 to 12 units per building. The building code has this provision where you can do 4 units on a floor, up to 3 floors with a single stair. Once you go past any of those limitations, you need to add a second stair. So there's actually sort of an economic equation where the 12 units is kind of the obvious, the reasonable, feasible financial limit to what these want to be. But again, this is getting to be a big enough scaled building. You're not mistaking this as a single family house, right? But these are getting upwards of 15 to 25 units to the acre. So again, in a plan diagram, what I was describing, here you have the ground floor, you have 4 units on that floor, but you have 3 floors with that, so this one is showing 12 units. And again, depending on how many stories there are, how you configure them, it could be 2 stories, 2.5 stories, it could be 3 stories, it could be a flat roof, pitched roof, again, any number of configurations. And these are all shown very symmetrical, but who's to say you don't break it up and do something funky and interesting if that made sense for the context you're trying to work within. So those were the building types, and what we thought would be helpful would also be then show how they might be applied to the different study areas that we've been talking about. So we'll start with Falmouth. So in the Davis Straits area, we just decided, because we thought it would be a good example, to capture a little corner of the shopping center down here. So that's Staples, Friendly's, and Starbucks. And again, you can see this transition going from very large format commercial Staples to single-story Cape Cod ranches just across the property line. So there's zero transition there, right, from almost your most intensive to your least intensive uses. So what we did was we took a handful of the types that we've been talking about and came up with just, again, a conceptual layout where maybe you have, actually I can use the arrow here. You have potentially 3-story mixed-use structure, so a little bit of commercial in the ground floor, but largely residential, as it transitions back out to Davis Straits or even to the continuation of the shopping center. And then as you make your way into the site, we would start to transition down from those being walk-ups. Maybe this one's only a 2-story walk-up to help start stepping down the scale. Maybe we have a couple double-deckers and manor houses in here that get us a little more density. But by the time we're down to our edge, where we're immediately adjacent to the single family, showing these as if they're just duplexes or maybe a 3-string of townhouses. So the intensity of the size of the footprint can go down, the number of units can go down, the height of the buildings can go down, so that you're slowly making that transition back down. But even still, this combined layout is achieving 20 units to the acre. This is 52 units with about 5,000 square feet of retail. So this, we think, would be a very reasonable approach to a setting like this in Davis Straits. What I'll point out in the upper left-hand corner, per your current zoning, we've broken just about every single rule that's in the current zoning. So current zoning allows a maximum density of 6 units to the acre. So think of all the examples we've shown you today. 6 wasn't any, like maybe a duplex, right, is 6 units to the acre. We're at 20 units to the acre. Maximum height is defined as 2.5 stories. We're showing 2 to 3 stories, so we're pretty close on that. We didn't push it to like 4 or 5 stories or anything crazy. And this also relies on reduced setbacks. The way that the zoning is written, if it's single family, the setbacks are kind of reasonable, but the second you go to multifamily, it's like 100-foot front setbacks and 50-foot rear setbacks, and it's crazy. You'd have like one building in the middle. Remember the East Greenwich example I showed early on? The big building in the middle of the lot? That's what the zoning is trying to achieve. There, we also broke all the rules, and we had to convince the people in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, that it was better to let us break up that building and get a little bit closer to our neighbors, but at least with a scale of building that made a little more sense. So here's what that could look like three-dimensionally. So to orient you, this is Davis Straits down here. This is where you turn into the parking area. The sea of parking still exists, but we've created our own nice little edge here of mixed-use buildings. Maybe there's a little plaza space. Don't worry, we still have Starbucks and Friendlies in the ground floor of these. You can see the notion of transitioning from a sort of 3-story scale, maybe down to 2 stories, or even as you come through here, 3 down to about 2.5, down to 2 before you get to the 1-story scale. So by using a mix of types, what we're able to do is get what we think are reasonable adjacencies, but still get the density up, because we got the higher density ones out at the front where they're not right up against the single family. And honestly, wouldn't you feel weird if you lived in a duplex, right on Davis Streets? So you got to find the right solution for each of the varying conditions that you have on the site. We also showed a rotary in that location because we know that's being considered. That was the most controversial thing in the whole talk so far. All right. So maybe not a rotary. We'll see. So we did the same thing in the other 2 areas as well. Thought we would share them because it's interesting to see how these all compare. So in Eastham, remember that the idea here was things wanted to be lower scale, right? So I'll go back. So you may or may not be familiar with Eastham, but this is Route 6 as it goes through town at a very high speed, unfortunately. They have a new Cumberland Farms here. There's a little old sort of strip center here. And this is really just a couple of these smaller 1-story, let's see, there's an ice cream joint, a Thai place, artichoke. But again, these are very sort of small scale, not particularly intensive uses. And what Eastham is searching for, Eastham doesn't have what you guys have, right? You have this vibrant, commercial core. Everybody, it's an identifiable center. People like to come walk there. Eastham's missing out on that. So they really wanted to try to envision how do we begin to create sort of that Main Street feel, an actual identifiable center in Eastham. The biggest challenge being that Route 6 is basically a 4-lane highway as it goes through the middle of there. That's another challenge that they need to solve. So what we proposed here was, again, a strategy where maybe there's some higher density stuff out along Route 6, some lower density stuff at the back end. Oh, again, I can use the arrow. Some lower density, duplexes and townhouses as you're transitioning to the single family units that are just behind. And we also began to show notions of, maybe there is a little open green space. It's not out on the main road, but it's 1 layer back. So you could come park here, get some dinner. It's a nice little place to be. Their current zoning, there are no density minimums or maximums. So again, Eastham just rewrote their zoning. So we were trying to test out their new zoning. What I thought was kind of clever is they don't get into density. That's not the issue at hand. What they restrict is the maximum footprint. Again, they're beginning to think a little bit more about the scale and character of the building and a little bit less about the numerical density that results from it. So they allow a maximum footprint of 3,000 square feet, and each of those individual footprints, this is 3,000 square feet, this is 3,000 square feet, that's just a little connector between them. But really what their zoning is more interested in is again, the scale of the buildings. Maximum height of 2 stories, we stuck to that. In this commercial area, they allow residential, but only if it's an accessory use, which is to say it has to be less than 50% of the either the area or the building. So if you just have a single building, you could do the 2nd floor residential, the 1st floor commercial. That would be 50%. Or the lot itself, you could do half residential, half commercial. So that's what we did in this first diagram, and this is also shown with all the required setbacks. So this meets their existing zoning. This meets what they allow now in their new zoning. And we were able to get 19 units and 24,000 square feet of retail, assuming those retail buildings are, or I should say commercial, are 2 stories, maybe retail on the first, offices up above. That results in an overall density, if you use the whole site for the units that are there, of only 5 units to the acre. Again, that's because it would be more fair to say on the half of the lot that's residential, you're more like 10 units to the acre. But what we wanted to do here was look at it a couple of ways. So first we looked at it just commercial along Route 6 as their code sort of suggests. What we think makes more sense, did you see that? The buildings changed color. Ooh. So in this instance, now they're mixed use buildings. So commercial on the ground floor because that's the activity they're trying to generate. But what our real issue is here is housing, right? That's what we're here talking about tonight. So maybe there's residential units above. So just by converting the second floor units to residential, now we're up to 35 units, and now we are achieving more like 10 units to the acre across the site. The one rule that we've broken is now we're greater than 50% residential, because we're 50% in the buildings and 50% of the lots. That's not the way their zoning is currently written or intended. And then last but not least, just because we wanted to see what it would yield, if we converted those front buildings to entirely residential, so just got rid of the commercial, again, almost just to let us compare it to some of the other sites. Now we're up to 51 units on this site, which is a density of about 14 units to the acre. So remember, the Falmouth example we showed was 20. This one's down to 14, in large part because we stepped down the scale, right? We're only going up to 2 stories in this case. And so this is the rendering of what that could look like. This is the Route 6 going through here. You can see these mixed-use buildings are only at 2 stories in scale, stepping down into some, couple 2-story manor houses, down to duplexes and townhouses, again, everything at 2 stories, but blending in pretty nicely and connecting back down to the surrounding communities. Last but not least, Orleans. So the site we identified, you can kind of see the circle there, at sort of the northern reach of their sort of core area. And there's this large Governor Prent's Inn, which is kind of an old motel, the time you drive up to and park at. So it's probably seen better days. It's probably lived a fruitful life, but it's probably time to move on. In this one, what we wanted to test was looking at some of the lower density types so that we really could show the full spectrum of all the types we were proposing. So in this case, when you're out on the main drag, we did show a single mixed-use building, but then already began to transition maybe even to some residential types out on Old Kings Highway. A lot of the commercial stuff that's out there now looks like it probably was a single-family home at one point that probably converted into an insurance office or whatever the case might be. But as we went further in, what we did was transition down to some of our townhouses, manor houses, and this was the first time where when we got in our back corners, we began to show that idea of those cottage courts, the little clusters of the single-family cottages. The result of this is we have 10 units to the acre on this site. So there's 50 units. They're anywhere from 2.5 to 1.5 stories. There was a little less pressure here in terms of the scale, and this one you actually, at the back of the site, instead of single family, you get the rail trail, and across from that is an existing townhouse community. So in some ways, this one probably could have supported more density than some of the other ones. But again, we were trying to show a range of different options and opportunities here. Orleans has also recently rewritten their zoning. They allow 10 units to the acre, which is what this is, and they have density bonuses that get you up to 14. If some number of these are deeded to be affordable, or if some number of them are smaller units than what are typically built, they have a couple of bonuses built in there. If you wanted to get a little bit higher, you can. And just showing what that looks like. In this case, we flipped it so we're actually at the back looking towards the front, just so you could see the notion of one of these little cottage courts. Again, units arranged around a little shared green space. All the parking's consolidated to one side. You can see how as you kind of make your way towards Main Street, the buildings are slowly stepping up in their scale. So again, just a quick density comparison to see how these, depending on which of our types, using the higher density types, maybe you're getting up to a blended of about 20 units to the acre. As you make your way across on the Orleans site, you're at about 10 units to the acre. So again, depending on how you use these, all of these are falling somewhere in that 10 to 20 unit per acre zone, which again is that moderate density middle ground that we're currently missing between single family and jumping up to the much bigger multifamily types that are typically out there. So I think that's it. Next steps. You want to talk to this?
Sure. So we offered an awful lot of details, but I think you can tell that the detail really is important. We're planning for community, you're planning for people, you're planning for the future of Falmouth in this case. And it really is an evolution of a multi-year planning process that you've been involved in for Davis Straits. What will come from this are really 3 different things. We'll be continuing to work with Union Studio, with Tom and Corey and the town planners from Eastham and Orleans to develop a form-based framework, taking the forms that you saw today and placing them in a form-based code approach that you could then think to apply in your own community. So taking the transition from conventional zoning and using some of the work that we've done here to evolve and think about a different form of zoning that results in the type of community that you desire over the long haul. We'll be convening a developers roundtable. We haven't talked about cost at all here, right? You know, there's an expectation that the type of design that our communities demand results in a higher cost product, and therefore may require more community investment or subsidy to make that happen. So we want to get an idea of what it really takes to build the type of development that's proposed here, and we'll be convening a developers roundtable to get at that. One of the things we'd like to be able to do is take the forms that were developed. We have a 3D model for Cape Cod. We can take these forms, which are available in a 3D dimension, apply them, really they can be planted anywhere on Cape Cod, and give you an idea of what either what they might look like visually and what some of the community impacts of those might be in land areas across the region. And then lastly, we've got a couple folks here from Barnstable, the town of Barnstable, who have been interested in this process and have identified an area in Hyannis where they'd like to do the same type of planning, leading to some rezoning efforts in that community. So really as a planning exercise, this is work on behalf of the town of Falmouth. We hope that what we've done here is useful to you over the long haul. And we'll be continuing to work with Tom and Corey over the next few months on the form-based code framework, and we'll work. This is the last of the public forum, so thank you to all of you, especially those of you that have hearings following this discussion. But we'll be working with Tom and Corey about how to bring that framework back to the planning board, and we're obviously open to working with you in the future. So, thank you.
I have a question. On some of the more dense properties on building codes, it wasn't clear whether elevators would be required. What's the state require for units? When do you have to start putting elevators into these buildings?
None of these would require it.
Jeremy, could you go to the microphone, please?
Absolutely.
How many, even though 6 and 7 unit buildings?
I'm pretty sure that even at that scale, the code doesn't require it. I will say that we've worked in these, actually all the examples I showed you at the very start, things we've done on the Cape, a lot of those have these typologies. And what we found is a lot of our clients, a lot of our developers are uncomfortable building a 3-story building from a market perspective without an elevator, especially because everybody thinks the only market right now are empty nesters, you know, and that there's no way they'd go up 2 flights of stairs. And that's fine. You just got to figure out how to work that into the cost. But I don't think the building code requires elevators for
I didn't know, I just
these
was
types.
questioning.
I got a question too.
Yeah.
You mentioned that Orleans and Eastham had recently changed some of their zoning laws. My question is, if we moved to form-based code here, would we need to change other parts of our code, or would that take care of what Eastham and Orleans are doing?
It could. It would depend on what the form of that looks like. But a form-based code can be something fairly simple, or it could be something very complex. And so it's up to you to determine what sort of things you're trying to build into that. I thought the Eastham example was interesting, where they didn't talk about density. They talked about a footprint that was already beginning to kind of lean a little bit towards a form-based code mentality, even though it wasn't really a full-fledged form-based code.
I'm just wondering what our steps should be. Should we go and change some of our codes now, work towards that, so we can, say, change the density per acre, or should we work more towards form-based and hope that that would take care of that issue?
Or do you work on, two on a parallel track? I would say if there's one that's a quick and easy, if it would, if you could quickly just increase the density allowable, even as an overlay district in the short term, while you're thinking through the more complex form-based code, it doesn't have to be an either or. Obviously, it might create double the work, and that's not what you're trying to do either. But I would say take whatever the path of least resistance is to get there sooner rather than later, but don't also, negate the possibility
We're
of
in
doing
the process now,
bigger.
trying to simplify our code book too, and
Yeah. Oh, yeah, everybody is. It's tricky. Once it's in there, it's hard to pull it back out, especially when people live there. Yeah.
Pat?
I love what you've done for the conceptual design for the plaza. But this is a big but, because we don't have really, really strong public transportation. And with your concept, I didn't see parking. What are you gonna do?
That's because I draw it so beautifully.
I know.
There was parking. I'll go back and I'll show it to you.
Well, I
But
saw some, but
Yeah,
it didn't seem to be enough.
believe it or not, we tried to stick to the required parking requirements.
Ah,
I will
okay.
say that back through here, so this is basically double-loaded parking all the way through. This covers a lot of the residential need, a lot of the retail need. We were assuming that the 1,000 parking spaces that are up there. We could probably figure out how to get that to work out. We thought we were actually pretty close. Retail has a much higher requirement than residential. So some of it is how much do you tip it towards residential versus retail. So even when you look at these other ones, fair amount of parking right where you need it for the retail. This one doesn't look like it has much, but that's because the types are getting to be a little bit lower. It's easier with like a duplex to sneak a side, a driveway to the side. But in any case, we thought we were being realistic. We weren't ignoring parking. I'll put it that way.
Now, the other comment is that I love that green spot, the central green that people could use there. Is there any way that conceptually that could be fit in when you do a little bit more tweaking for Falmouth?
We could, although I would say that this one we showed sort of a centralized green. And this one, believe it or not, we think that retail plaza, especially when you see it in that
Well, you had mentioned that,
three dimension, there's a fair amount of space in there, and we tried to show, here's a little sort of eyebrow green. So, that can take many forms. It doesn't always have to be sort of the big lawn.
Yeah.
And again, this was also just illustrative, right? Where I'd love if we got a call from whoever owns this property to say, let's do it,
So would
right? Yeah, so, and that was one of the things we were a little bit worried about too, right? Let's like, these are meant to be illustrative, that's not to say it's happening. But, we talked to the town planners about sites that made sense that people probably wouldn't be too upset about, but, so.
Yeah?
So I'm just sort of curious, do communities that you've worked in start with form-based zoning in specific areas so that you have a traditional type of zoning in some areas, and then you have form-based zoning, and hope that at some point the form-based takes over the community?
That's often the case. Like you might identify something like your core area or define some district and do a form-based code for that district. It might not make sense for all of the single-family residential areas to do a form-based code. You could. There's nothing to stop you. There are certainly places that also do a form-based code. They literally throw all the old regulations out and start from scratch with a form-based code through and through. But again, I think you could take a couple different approaches depending on what made the most sense here. So, do you do one just for Davis Straits? Do you do one for, everything that's sort of your village center? And again, they take many different forms too. That's the other challenge with it. You can really get into the weeds on those if you wanted, or, you try not to, but.
Have you seen any communities use form-based code in areas that are heavily impacted by the new flood zone construction? I mean, the face of our town is changing. We don't have any design review in our residential areas, and everyone's coming, a lot of people come to me in the planner, why don't you do something about this? Why, we can't. We don't really get involved in it, but I'm just wondering, is there a way that we could have a flood zone form-based code on, so when houses do get knocked down, and that we at least have an expected result of what they're gonna look like and not be surprised by what they conjure up out of whatever they can get out of the zoning code.
Right. No, I think you could. You absolutely could. You could say that's a very specific issue in a very specific location with a very specific set of challenges. These are the forms that we think are acceptable to trying to address that. It's tough. There's not a whole lot of different ways of doing elevate the building
No,
11
but
feet
we
off
could
the
at least
ground, but-
specify materials and openings and sizes and interface with the street instead of, well, I don't want to you've answered my question, I'll leave it
Yeah,
at that.
yeah, and I'll say too, I mean, you probably still have a lot of existing properties there too, and there might be a number of strategies that you would
Right.
propose for an existing property that could still improve upon its
Right.
condition for those sorts of things, so yeah.
That way, at least people know, what they could do. They could have their plan that would fit.
I will say one thing about form-based codes, because they're often very visual, it's a lot easier for the average person to try to understand what you're getting at. A traditional zoning regulation is a 300-page bunch of words, couple tables, unless you're an expert, it's hard to kind of sift your way through. So I do think because they are highly visual codes, it's also very helpful for that. You can often simplify key issues to a single page even, where a particular resident could understand, this is what I'm up against here, so it can be very helpful that way.
Charlotte?
An implementation over time. This can only take place as the owners of those properties want to create changes. They're either selling them and the new developer falls under the new rules, or the existing owners want to take advantage of it. Could you give some idea of, say, for the piece that you've chosen, where the owners are whoever owns Friendly's and Staples, that set of buildings? How many owners there are there? Would they have to cooperate together? And would they see this as being economically more advantageous to them than all of that asphalt?
I think in the particular examples we showed, each of those was a single parcel, so a single owner. So we simplified things that way. I will say, I think it's one thing I'll be curious to see as we do the next one in Barnstable and Hyannis. The area we've identified is really, we still have to sort of solidify that as an area, but it may be more about scattered sites, so we might have a very different kind of approach there. But I think to answer your question about the economic viability, I'm not sure. I have to imagine that, I don't know how much, income Staples is bringing in. It's probably doing pretty good. But certainly the motel, the motel in Orleans, I can't imagine that's bringing in tons of dollars, and there's a real need on the Cape for housing. I don't know about the retail side of things, but most communities we work in, there's usually more than enough retail. So often the transition from retail to residential is something that makes sense. The ultimate challenge, is, as Heather alluded, is trying to figure out how this stuff becomes affordable on the Cape where building costs are very high. But again, if you can leverage 50 units on the same acreage that you might otherwise build 8, that certainly is a helpful thing for cost. Yeah.
Everybody all set?
Yeah, I just have a quick comment. I know this is about density, and it's very nice to see the comparison from the community participation, particularly Easton and Falmouth, how the attitudes are very different.
Mm-hmm.
But most people are fearful of density.
Mm-hmm.
How do you address that issue in some of these communities?
The goal was that by giving it a form, giving it something that you can look at, again, the fact that at the end of the day you might show, these types, that what is density? Well, if this was built in your neighborhood, would that scare you? Maybe they'd be like, no, this is actually reasonable. If I said we're proposing a multifamily building that's 15 units to the acre, again, it kind of back to that, what they see versus what they're trying to read in a chart. So, the objective of this exercise was really to kind of create something that hopefully educates and informs the public. I think one thing we need to talk about is, how does this continue to have life beyond these couple of public presentations? Maybe it's a report, maybe it's something else where we can have the information there so that when it comes up in your community, maybe you guys can point them to, hey, go look, Cape Cod Commission's got a great little study on their website that shows what this could be. Or when a developer comes in and shows you business as usual and you're like, this is lousy, you could get the same number of units taking a different approach. Go see what these guys are talking about.
Bob?
What scares people about density, it'd be fine if everybody just stayed in their unit and never left.
Mm-hmm.
It's when they go out onto the street, they're getting in vehicles and they're on the roads. And the Cape is famous for all these dead ends where everybody's got to go out to a main road. I think that's the biggest issue we have to address, and Pat touched on the fact of public transportation.
Yeah.
These things have to go hand in hand, because if you just say we're going to put 50 units on an acre and there's 50 families living there, people are thinking 50 to 100 vehicles.
Yep.
And not everybody's going to be riding bikes or hopping on the Swish train or the bus, rather, so.
Yeah, I have yet to work on a project where traffic wasn't a concern.
Yeah.
But to your point, the benefit here, at least the areas we've identified, it's not tucked way back in the residential neighborhoods.
Right.
This is right on the main drags.
Yeah.
If you were going to do forms of mass transit, it's going to be on that corridor. So in some ways, they could go hand in hand.
Will go where
right?
there is density, too. We've
Yeah.
seen that, too. They're not going to go to someplace where there isn't anybody to pick up.
Exactly.
But if the density is there, they will eventually move to that area and start transporting people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mr. McGrath?
I'm Michael McGrath, a registered engineer and professional land surveyor, and I get permits for people for projects like this. And the major problem with the Starbucks Staples area is we have a flow control bylaw. And so you're not going to be able to fit those units unless something changes dramatically under the flow control bylaw. For instance, the restaurant is considered to be the same as a 4-bedroom dwelling unit. So we have some other challenges. The wastewater treatment plant operates at 3 parts per million, and to get that kind of increase, you'd have to have the wastewater treatment plant operate better, and that's going to be very difficult. So anyways, there is, I hate to bring up the fly in the ointment, but there's
That's a
something we
challenge for our
have to
selectmen. They
address.
need to work on that.
We'll add it to the list of rules we broke.
I just might add that it's also an opportunity to plan for housing supply and the future at the same time as you're planning for water
Yeah.
quality, and that is an opportunity.
And I believe the selectmen have identified this area actually to be one of the areas where they will give waivers to it because it fits with our local comprehensive plan and a long-range vision. So I think we have taken that into consideration. And I think what the problem they really need to find is how they get rid of the effluent is the plant has tons of capacity. What they can't get rid of is the water after it's clean, and that's a challenge they need. Don't want to debate this. We have a lot of things to do, Mike, okay?
I just want to point out
We
that
have many people waiting.
the 500-pound gorilla is DEP, because they're the ones that will either allow or not allow. And I've applied for these, believe me, I know.
We've met them. We know who they are. Okay, we have a very busy night. Thank you very much. I'm ecstatic. This is something that we've been dreaming about for a long time, and you met our expectations with this tonight. Now, this PowerPoint presentation, you're leaving with us, right?
We
have
are,
it?
we are.
And can we cut it up? I mean, if I wanted to just use the Falmouth pieces, am I allowed to do that?
Sure.
Okay, I just want to ask, because there's certainly some things I think we could use. I don't really want to be talking about what's going on in Orleans or Eastham or any of those places, but I think for Falmouth people, that'd be great. Absolutely terrific. Thank you.
Thank you. One last plug. The website, Cape Cod Commission, CRBD, which is Community Resiliency by Design. So if you want to stay plugged into next steps, what's going on, that's your spot. So
Fantastic.
thank you again. Very much appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thank you.
That stand for CRB.
Communities, something by design.
Wow.
That's exactly.
Hey,
I know.
this was envisioned
I
in a
know,
little
it's
room.
just amazing. We've been talking about this for 4 or 5 years and
Yeah.
see it happen. Thank you very much. And this all came out of that,
It's the problem with the way it looked, the different proposed.
okay, I'm gonna, a 1-minute recess, and let everyone get set up.
Low-income
Yeah.
housing.
Very much. The next is a public discussion and the site plan review application. Applicant Michael and Cynthia George, a site plan review application to construct an accessory apartment at 108 Gansett Road. For the applicant, is that you, Laura? Oh, notices, sorry, he reminded me and I skipped over it again, sorry.
Mr. Chairman, the public meeting notice was published on October 5th, 2018, and 6 abutters were notified by regular mail.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. For the record, I am Laura Moynihan, a Falmouth attorney representing the applicant. There's quite a lot going on here on this property. We have the consultants all here to answer questions. The architect, Hart Associates, Steve Hart and Jennifer Lyford, Matthew Cunningham and Jen Stevens, the landscape architects, and Mr. McGrath from Holmes and McGrath, whose firm has done the surveying and engineering. So this is an application for an accessory apartment site plan review. We're looking for the apartment approval as a caretaker residence for this site. It's 3.64 acres. This is the former Wang Estate in Woods Hole at 108 Gansett Road. So right now, the property contains 2 dwellings. This is one of them. This was traditionally the guest dwelling house. And the next one is the main house. These structures were both built around the 1920 era. This is a very large main house, what I'll be calling the principal structure for the purposes of the hearing. and the former slide, excuse me, is the accessory structure. So both of these dwellings existed prior to 1959. We do have an application before the Zoning Board of Appeals to raise and reconstruct both of these dwellings. So we'll show you some pictures of that part of the project just for your information and so you can get a sense of what's happening on this property. But these are both grandfathered. They were used as dwellings prior to 1959, and both will be reconstructed as dwellings.
Laura, I'm confused by
It doesn't look like that.
you calling this an accessory structure.
Hmm.
So are you trying to put an accessory apartment in a, which is primary and which is secondary, and which one do we measure to the size, or are they both? We're really confused by this.
I know, and so, this building, for the purposes of the accessory apartment bylaw, I am calling the accessory structure. Our bylaw doesn't have a definition of accessory dwelling, and it doesn't have a definition of a principal dwelling. We don't have those definitions in our bylaw, but we do have accessory structure and principal structure. So as far as the accessory apartment bylaw goes, there is not a specific path when you have two dwellings on one property. So for the purposes of this application, we are applying to construct the accessory apartment within an accessory structure. So for the purposes of comparison of the floor area and the size, we would be using the principal structure, which is the big main house, for those comparison purposes. But also the data that we've provided you shows that the accessory apartment within the accessory structure also meets the guidelines under the accessory apartment bylaw. So I'm proposing, for the purposes of the zoning board, that they take both the principal structure and the accessory structure and use them both as a comparison when we're looking at, is it 800 square feet or less than the percentage of floor area. Now, in both cases here, the 800 square feet is the applying factor, because the percentage of floor area that the apartment makes up is about 19% of the reconstructed accessory structure. And in the case of the main house, it's about 3.7%. So for the purposes of the accessory apartment, we're applying the 800 square foot limitation. Is that clear?
How many units are in the rest of that structure?
There will be a guest dwelling in the remaining part of the structure, which I'll show you the floor plans on that. So this existing dwelling would be reconstructed as the accessory structure with a dwelling in it, and we're proposing the accessory apartment within the accessory structure. The principal dwelling would be reconstructed as well, the principal structure. So again, this is unique. This is not something that you've seen before, but it does fit within the bylaw. It is allowable. If you look at the language of the bylaw, we're still talking about an accessory structure here when you compare it to the principal structure on the property. And the bylaw allows an accessory apartment within the accessory structure. Our bylaw doesn't say you can't have another dwelling in the accessory structure. So that prohibition isn't there.
Well, our
Okay.
zoning does, but this is pre-existing, so
Right.
that's the,
That's right.
that's why I'm having a hard time.
Right. It's a grandfathered use.
Yeah.
So that will be a use issue that the Zoning Board of Appeals will have to deal with on the special permit. They'll have to grant a special permit for this accessory apartment as well. So what we're here for is site plan review. This is not a special permit for the accessory apartment. This is site plan review. So we're looking
And
at,
design review.
and design review. We're looking at the design. We're looking at access and circulation and landscaping.
The part I don't get is in our accessory apartment bylaw, it says a couple of times to having the architectural effect of a single-family home. How does this work here?
Well, because this will look like a single-family home. So if you let me show you some of these slides.
Okay?
This is the existing conditions plan showing what's on the property now. You see what we're calling the accessory structure closest to the street, and then the principal structure closest to the water. This is the landscape plan showing the layout for the new accessory structure with the accessory apartment, and the landscape architect will talk a little bit more about this. And this is the landscape portion of the plan showing the principal structure as rebuilt. This is the Holmes and McGrath site plan, so you see that there are some changes here. This has all gone through the Conservation Commission as well. There's about 30,000 square feet of restoration plantings being proposed on this property. So there's a lot going on here. The Conservation Commission recently approved that. So this is the accessory structure as we propose it to be rebuilt. And the portion that's closest here on what I'll call the left side is the accessory apartment portion, and the remaining portion is the second dwelling. This is the proposed entrance to the accessory apartment. We're asking for this apartment as a caretaker residence for this estate. And again, this is a large property in Woods Hole, but it is an estate property. It requires a caretaker. This is the main entrance to the estate as proposed. And here we have the west elevation for the accessory structure with the apartment, south elevation, and the east elevation. So to answer your question, when you're looking at the design characteristics, we're looking at this building only for the purposes of the site plan review and the design review, because that's what your jurisdiction is this building. And how does this look like a single-family dwelling, which is what it is, with an accessory apartment.
How are you dealing with the owner occupancy part of our bylaw?
Owner occupancy is within the principal structure, which is the larger house. Okay, so that's how the property can comply with that section of the bylaw.
Just having a hard time.
I know, and I appreciate that.
Okay.
It's a very
I'm getting there.
different situation.
Getting there. Thank you.
And that's why I'm using the term accessory structure and principal structure. These are the floor plans, which are all in your file. This is the existing floor plans for the accessory structure. You have a basement. There's a first floor with a garage and a second floor existing right now. So this is the existing dwelling within the accessory structure with a kitchen. These are the proposed floor plans. So you have an unfinished basement. You have a proposed first floor plan with a garage as well. And then you have the proposed second floor plan with the lower portion of the plan showing the accessory apartment, as well as the rebuilt dwelling living space, main dwelling living space. This is the plan that's in your file showing the square footage comparison for the living spaces within that accessory structure. And so these are the elevations, just for your information, for the principal structure to be reconstructed. Again, this will require a special permit from the zoning board. So just showing you these for your information, so you can see the design details that have gone into it. The floor plans, these are in your file as well. First floor plan with the garage, second floor plan, and the attic plan. And then we have some renderings of the entire estate we included to give you an idea of really the vastness of this property and what's going on here. There's a view from the northern abutter, a view from the southern abutter, and over the south lawn and the northwest lawn. And this is an outdoor kitchen, again in the principal structure. Dining area, the infinity wall that's being proposed, pool, the pool deck bar, and the long view of the lake. You'll see the accessory structure in the background. as being rebuilt, and this is overlooking the pond. And what they're calling this the guest house, but this is the view from the accessory structure towards the water. So the architect is here, and we'll go through some of the design elements on the project. I just want to go through a couple of technical issues. So under the accessory apartment bylaw, as you know, the planning board's required to take into account the design standards, the requirements and purposes of the accessory apartment bylaw. So you would say, well, how does this fit into the purposes of the accessory apartment bylaw? Well, really, I think how it fits is that we're proposing it as a caretaker residence. So we are proposing it as an employee of this property who can live on site. I think that when you look at the purpose of that bylaw is to broaden the range of housing choices by increasing the number of small dwelling units, to encourage a greater diversity of population with particular attention to young adult citizens, and to allow aging in place for seniors, to promote more economic energy. So because of the nature and wording of that bylaw, I think that you can include this caretaker residence in that. Here you'll be able to have a 2-bedroom unit where a single person or a couple, possibly somebody even with a small child, can live and work on this property. It's a beautiful location, obviously, to live in, an 800 square foot apartment. There'd be minimal traffic generated because the employee is on site, working on site and living on site. So it is a unique type of situation, but I think as the accessory apartment bylaw is evolving in the community, I think, quite honestly, you may see more applications like this, because it does make sense for these large estate properties to have an accessory apartment for a caretaker to live on site. And some do not now, but it certainly fits within that, I would submit to you. Again, this property is almost 4 acres in Woods Hole. The lot coverage that's being proposed is well below that it's allowed under the bylaw. So we're proposing about 10% by structures and 18% overall. The allowed lot coverage is 40% overall. So still a relatively low lot coverage. The owner has a need for these guest quarters in the accessory structure because of the size of family, large family, a lot of visitors, a lot of guests coming to this estate to enjoy this beautiful property. So hopefully I've explained the technicalities of the bylaw, and that's clear. And I'd like to ask Steve or Jen to go through some of the design elements with you for the accessory structure. But again, we're looking at here the 800 square foot limitation because that's our maximum, given that the floor area for both the accessory structure and the principal structure are below the 40% limit.
I have a question on the numbers. I went through the math. I did not see any calculations for parking spaces for this unit in that 800 square feet.
Okay, in the accessory apartment worksheet that we filed, so the number of parking spaces required for the accessory structure is 4, and the number that's provided is 4. So I'll actually ask Steve or Jen to talk about that parking issue, because I think there's some information on the driveway as well that would be important to your review.
So that's the accessory residence
Hi, good evening. My name is Stephen Hart, Hart Associates Architects, and with me is Jen Lyford for this project. To quickly review the salient aspects of the existing conditions, as Laura pointed out, it is a 3.6 acre site with a principal house and an accessory structure. The main house, go back to the site plan, Jen. The main house is along the water's edge, and the accessory structure, the existing accessory structure is up much closer to Gansett Road. The driveway runs along the northern boundary of the property and ends up more or less in the middle of the site in front of the main house. The entire site is cultivated, trees, grass, gardens. The proposed accessory structure with an accessory apartment is located in the same vicinity as the existing accessory structure. Its intended use, as Laura pointed out, is for family and friends of the owners to spend time here. The accessory apartment is for a full-time year-round caretaker. The structure is sited so as to keep a distinction between the structures, allow some space in that landscape. The principal dwelling and the accessory structure are separated. The siting also allows for views to the ocean from along the southern boundary of the property past the main house. And furthermore, the caretaker's apartment has a presence on the street that is distinct from the main house and the guest portion of the accessory structure. Let me go to the plans of the. So the entire dwelling, the entire building, I should say, is comprised of the, as I said, the guest quarters as well as the accessory apartment. On the proposed first floor plan, you're seeing 3 car storage bays as well as the main floor plan of the guest quarters. On the second floor, you're seeing primarily several bedrooms and bathrooms that are guest quarters. And then at the bottom of the page, that is the 800 square foot accessory apartment. The main entrance is in the lower right-hand corner, directly off the porch that faces Gansett Road. One enters into a small vestibule. There is a living room, a kitchen with an eating area, and two bedrooms and a bathroom. We go to the proposed site plan, Jen. Thanks. So the access, Jen and Matthew will speak more about, but the proposed access is for the informal 2-tire track driveway to enter as a distinct entrance from the main house. And the whole purpose there is to allow some privacy, both for the caretaker and the owners, so that dwelling has its own identity and its own presence. The people going on to the main house or the guest house would turn left and park in front of the guest house or continue on towards the water in the main house.
And the parking, there's one parking spot for the accessory apartment, and that's the parking spot that has its own entry, and then there's 3 spots for the guest.
So there's no garage included for the 800 square foot, because we would make you count that square footage for the garage as part of that structure, but if it's outside, it's just outside
It's
parking.
outside. Yep.
Finally getting to understand this.
Yeah,
Good.
there's no garage for that.
Good. So I think, but before I talk about the architectural style, it's worth mentioning that the proposed project upgrades the entire infrastructure on the site, not just the buildings. Restoration planting, as Laura mentioned, new septic systems employing current technologies, engineered site drainage system, bringing the entire property up to current environmental standards. So on to architectural style. So the palette of materials we are proposing is very much a traditional Cape Cod palette with wood shingle roof, wood shingle wall cladding, fieldstone foundation and site walls, true divided light windows, painted white trim, porches and dormers, and scale elements that give the composition a more traditional feel than what is currently there. The gambrel shape with multiple porches, And we could run through the next slide. So so that's the ocean-facing side, what's that, the west side? I'm sorry, yes, there it is. And then back up one or go forward. This is the least evident side, the backside, if you will. But then what I wanted to point out is that the caretaker's apartment has, thanks to the grading and thanks to the way the site and the street work, a very low-scale presence on the street. So,
Is there a second floor in this structure, or is that just attic?
go one more slide, Jen. So or back one to the caretaker's apartment is on the second floor. What's on the first floor, if you will, is
Okay.
garage. Yeah.
All right.
So there's no attic.
It's a one-story element that's
It's a
on the upper
one-story
floor.
element,
Yeah,
okay.
it's on the upper floor. Yeah. Be happy to take questions later, but I'm going to turn it over to Jen
So
Stevens.
when
Oh, go ahead.
when you measured the area for all those rooms, they weren't in a second floor, they're all on a first,
Go to the
what we call
plan.
BAS on our, they're just the ground, what is you walk in the front door, like the ground floor from the door walking in. There's no stairwell going up to an additional room?
There is no
There's-
stairwell, there's a stairwell going down into the
Basement?
basement
Okay.
space. Yeah. And we
Hard-
calculated the square footage by, because the 2 bedrooms are under the roof, we calculated, the 2 dormers, we calculated that whole space, but then the space under the roof, we counted from 5 feet down.
See, that's the biggest problem we're having, is understanding the measurement of these things, and that's what I was trying to get at.
Yep.
So okay.
So we use the definition of how the square footage is calculated for gross floor area.
And whose definition is that?
The Falmouth zoning, that, there's, Falmouth zoning.
Okay.
Jen, go to the long elevation looking at the overhead doors.
He's saying you need to speak in the microphone.
Sorry.
When you walk away, no one at home could hear you. We just got
Got it.
poked from the TV.
Sorry, you're looking
Sorry.
for the.
The guest house, long elevation. There. Next. No, sorry. Okay. There. So, perhaps this is helpful. The caretaker's apartment is the small element on the upper left.
Yes.
Really, everything else is guest quarters for the main family.
What's behind the window on that?
That's
Gable, right there.
that's a decoration. On the other end, there's a vaulted ceiling.
Up,
No.
all the way at the top?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
window, it's decoration.
Okay, so that's an unfinished
There's
attic or what, some other, that's what I'm trying to get at.
Or if there's a cathedral ceiling, we haven't gotten into the
Okay.
details, but it's not occupiable, and it doesn't, even with an 8-foot ceiling, it doesn't meet the 5-foot. There's nothing.
That's what I was just trying to grab, because we're wrestling with how to measure these things.
Yeah.
It is looking this way.
Okay, continue.
You can see this rounded part? You see that porch on the right-hand end? That's this, right here. And here are the gables, the 3.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the board. My name is Jen Stevens. I'm with Matthew Cunningham Landscape Design. We have been working in partnership with Hart Associates, Holmes McGrath, and Blue Flax Design for almost 2 years now on the master plans for the property. If you'll bear with me while I scroll to the right slide here. We know the site very well. It sits within an amazing context, as you know. There's a significant amount of topography on the site. Moving from Gansett Road, we actually drop 60 feet in elevation as you move to Buzzards Bay. And about 13 feet of that grade change occurs within our area of focus this evening. Am I going the wrong way? Okay. Sorry. Here we go. So our focus area this evening, as I said, starting at the high point at Gansett Road at elevation 60, we actually drop a total of 13 feet to the lower parking court of the proposed accessory structure.
We are also, we have done a full inventory of existing canopy trees on site. There's a significant amount of canopy as you move from Gansett Road, and it becomes sparser as you move to the waterfront side of the property. Wherever possible, we're preserving mature trees that are healthy and non-hazardous. There are some locations where the limits of grading and proposed infrastructure and utility improvements are requiring removal of trees. In those locations, we are proposing a fairly dense planting approach of proposed screening material, which will be a mixture of evergreen and deciduous trees, white oak, arborvitae, American holly, and then we'll also be weaving in layers of understory shrubs consisting of viburnum and rhododendron. And the goal is to create a very naturalized planting buffer, which doesn't look too ornamental given the context of Gansett Road and the neighborhood. As Steve and Jen mentioned, we are taking advantage of the natural change in elevation so that the building is nestled into the topography. So the advantage of doing that is the front facade of the accessory apartment within the accessory structure. It only has a one-story presence from Gansett Road. And if you'll bear with me again, hopefully I'm going the right direction with these slides. So this is the vantage point from Gansett Road of our proposed entrance to the caretaker's apartment. And it is intended solely for use by the caretaker of the property. We have deliberately designed this so that it's subordinate to the main entrance, which will be announced by 2 stone pillars. We'll probably engrave the address numerals in one of those pillars, so it's clear when you arrive to the property what is the main entrance. All of the proposed driveways and parking areas will be porous, with the exception of cobble aprons in some locations. We also will be revegetating all of the disturbed areas and slopes with native ground covers, such as hay-scented fern. So here is a good example. You can see the grade change between the parking court of the garage and the main entrance to the accessory apartment. We are going to have a small staircase between the two, but it's over 10 feet. So that's part of the reason driving the separate entrance to the caretaker's apartment, because their front door, which they will use 90% of the time, is 10 feet higher than the parking court, which will be intended for guests and family to use. We haven't talked in detail about the other improvements of the property. You've seen some of the images. Clearly, it's a complex project. We are proposing significant improvements, and with those improvements, we all know comes a responsibility in terms of the investment and commitment to ongoing property care and maintenance. This is intended to be a legacy property for the George family. So in that vein, they want to be responsible and plan for the care that's necessary to maintain an estate such as this, which is why we have, as sensitively as we can to the context and the character of the architecture, integrated some discrete amenities, which we hope will attract and retain a caretaker who will be able to steward this property and hopefully span maybe a couple of generations, so that this property doesn't fall into disrepair like, you know, much of the structures have, unfortunately, that we're proposing to demolish. So with that, we're happy to answer questions and take comments. Laura, if you have.
Thank you, Jen. Mike McGrath is here, and there was a referral from the engineering department that I would like to ask him to address. I don't know if the members of the board saw that referral, but there were some comments about, the dry wells. But the issue was raised about the site distance and the access point on that secondary caretaker driveway. So I'd like Mike, I know we've run on here long, it's getting late, but just a couple minutes to address that with you, if that's okay.
My name is Michael McGrath. I'm a registered engineer and professional land surveyor. I just handed you some revised site plans. The site plans were revised because of a referral from the engineering department, and also there is a minor mistake in the topographic survey that would be in about this area. It's not significant, but I did fix it. The revised plans show that there's now going to be a strip of bituminous concrete between the apron and the cobblestone apron and the edge of Gansett Road. That's so the snowplow blade doesn't catch. Then the department wanted us to talk about having a bituminous concrete apron here, and so the revised plans show a 5-foot bituminous concrete apron. If you've been to the site, this road's posted over and over again, it's 20 miles an hour. The engineering department wondered what the available site distance was on the coming out of the caretaker's driveway or the accessory apartment's driveway right in here. And what we did is, this is a 20-mile-per-hour road. The safe stopping distance is 115 feet, which is pretty short. And there's 280 feet to the south and 350 feet available from 10-foot back here where you would measure it. So there's an adequate site distance. We also show that on the plans there are notes that describe that all of the roof runoff is diverted into dry wells. And so I believe that we've answered the issues brought up by the engineering department. I'm happy to answer any engineering questions you might have concerning the project.
Anybody have any engineering questions? I think we're all set.
Thank you.
Just
Other
one-
questions?
How big is this lot?
It's 3.64 acres.
Okay, what's that translate to square feet?
43,000 times, anybody have a calculator?
43560
Times three, okay, so,
times,
okay,
Yeah,
okay.
43,500 per acre, so
Okay.
158,000.
I think it fits.
Yeah, this whole thing.
No, I heard 80 somewhere. in
I
there,
heard,
so
I thought I heard
I-
80 or 90.
Yeah, so
that too,
I just
but
wanted that to be
We
clarified.
got a lot to absorb here.
Koi pond.
Charlotte, any questions?
I have a question on that.
No, I think it's an unusual application of our accessory bylaw. Unforeseen.
Paul?
Yeah, that circular building says it's just a guest quarters, and then you have a pool in front of it. Is the rest of it a natural pool? What is the blue area?
It's a koi pond type of natural pool. The pool that you see,
It's man-made.
yeah, there is a pool with the main dwelling, but this,
Whole area, yeah.
yeah.
So that'll be a pool and above the pond, is that what it is?
I'll let Jen explain it better than me.
So there's a dashed outline here, which aligns with the structural walls. So that will be a structural natural swimming pool. And the more organic shape beyond that limit will be likely a liner pond with marsh shelves built up with planting medium. So it will be a natural swimming pool within a pond, if you will. And then at the primary structure, there is a conventional swimming pool. There's a natural dell, there's a depression right here on site, and it's surrounded by these large oak trees. So we are taking advantage of a natural low point on the site, and we're also going to be able to utilize that for some of the stormwater.
I'm not familiar with the term natural pool.
So natural swimming pools are, I don't know how long they've been around. It's a pretty interesting phenomenon. It's a hybrid between a pond and a gunite swimming pool. So there typically is some sort of a gunite structure, and then rather than relying on conventional pool equipment for sanitation and filtration, there are designed zones of aquatic plants which provide natural filters. So graphically, this stippling that you see here is to note the areas that would be not open water, but those would be the marsh zones, which would be acting as the natural filters.
So that
Something to be-
natural pool is not necessarily year-round.
It won't be used year-round. It will not have a winter cover, you know, like a conventional swimming pool would have. It would freeze and look more like a pond.
Is that just natural drainage?
Pardon?
Is that natural drainage to feed that pond?
No, there will be an irrigation well to supplement, in addition to collecting a lot of the roof water to use as a supplemental backup to keep up with the evaporation rates in the summer months.
And you could swim in it, which was my question.
Septic.
John, you got any questions down there?
No, thank you.
Pam?
No, I'm just a little astounded by the size of the structure going from whatever it is up to 21,000 square feet, and the fact of the need for extra guest housing.
Well, there is a lot going on the property, and I think that you have to keep in mind that this is an estate in Woods Hole, and it's really not uncommon. And there are other properties in Falmouth that have multiple guest quarters on them. You know, guest houses that are separate, boat houses where people stay, because it's the nature of this kind of property where people are invited to stay for extended periods of time, and they're looking for privacy. So, yes, it is unique, and I certainly appreciate that. And you may be saying, as I think you had commented, it's an unusual application of the accessory apartment bylaw, and it is. But I think if you focus on the accessory apartment and the purpose of that apartment, and I'm expecting that the Zoning Board of Appeals would likely condition their permit for it to be a caretaker residence, because it's providing on-site housing for an employee. So if you take the focus away from the vastness of the changes on this, on really, if you've been down there, it's really a very impressive property, even with the existing structures. I mean, the existing house is massive with 10 bedrooms and, you know, all sorts of different quarters to it. So, but if the planning board takes the focus away from what else is going on the property and concentrates on the accessory apartment and why we're proposing the accessory apartment, I think you can find that it does fit within the purpose and intent of the accessory apartment bylaw, because it's going to be a caretaker residence. It's going to provide a form of housing for an employee on site, and it's going to be a lovely, lovely place for this employee and his or her family to live.
And the owners will be occupying the main house,
Correct.
so that the actual accessory building may not have a permanent or 7-month resident there.
That's correct, and that's permitted under the bylaw, as
I'm
long
aware of
as, the principal structure is owner occupied for the 7
We'll
months.
get an annual affidavit to that effect.
Yes,
We're
sir.
trying to see how this fits into it.
Yes, and all of those things, again, because the apartment is proposed within an accessory structure, it requires a special permit from the zoning board for the accessory apartment. So there are 2 layers of review here. So the zoning board will have to grant a special permit for the use of the accessory apartment. And the planning board's role is site plan review and design, and, you know, looking at the purpose and intent of the bylaw. So if you kind of break it down, you know, I met with the town planner, and we both agreed that there's a lot going on here, but we thought it would be beneficial to show you everything, rather than try and just piece it out and then have, you know, a lot of wondering and a lot of questions and possibly even confusion. So we thought it best to just lay it all out on the table, and this is what's going on the entire property, but then really try to bring it back and rein it into the focus of site plan and design review for this apartment and the building that the apartment is going to be in only. So hopefully we did that. Oh, good.
Yes.
To me, I wonder if it does to the others. It appears to fit the requirements that we have set forth in the bylaw. And one way to see this is that we just had no idea that it was such an encompassing bylaw. But it fits.
I think it does. I'm really having a hard, we're working my way through it.
Okay, when I first looked at the plan, I thought, this can't possibly be right. But with the new version of the changes that we're proposing before town meeting, we enlarged. We had originally said garage or barn on the property. You could put an accessory apartment in it. But we enlarged it because there are other forms of accessory buildings, such as a carriage house. Well, it's not a carriage house, it's a guest house. And it's an accessory guest house, and I'm not having a problem conceptualizing this now. I don't see a problem with it.
Is there 2 dwellings on this site now, or 3? What is the, because you're gonna, that's, the use isn't our question, but just to help me understand it.
Right, there are 2 dwellings on the property now.
I'm good. That's what I
Okay.
needed to hear.
And all I can say is, the main point is that the bylaw as written right now does not specifically prohibit an accessory apartment within an accessory structure that also contains a dwelling, all right? So by that means, I would say it's permitted.
Jim,
Yes.
if, I'd be curious to know if the accessory bylaw didn't exist in Falmouth, and they still wanted to do this, how would it have been presented in the absence of the accessory bylaw?
They would have a zoning problem. They're adding a 3rd unit to a pre-existing, that's a zoning issue. So yes, they couldn't do it without this, because I don't think they would, it's not our job, but I don't think the ZBA would create another unit out of it.
Well, I think, I mean, quite honestly, I think what would likely happen is that you would have some type of caretaker's residence, but it wouldn't have a kitchen, which
Right.
would be really unfortunate,
Right.
because it should have a kitchen.
That's what you're getting.
Right,
It
and so
becomes a
you-
real dwelling.
It becomes not a dwelling by definition because it doesn't have a kitchen. But you would want some place for the caretaker to stay. So now you have a caretaker that can't cook. Well, that's silly, right? I
Well,
mean, there should be a kitchen, and it should be.
Bylaws taking care of caretakers as well. Well, it wasn't envisioned, just,
I don't think this is gonna be the last one we see
no, I don't
like
think
this.
so either. Actually, I know it won't be.
Jim, one.
Yes, Paul?
Mr. McGrath, one final question. You have 2 septic systems, both 2,000 gallons. And how does the underground impact discharge to the natural pool that you have there? They're on the other side of that pool.
The pool has to be lined in order for it to store water. So the landscape architect described that this would be a lined pond. You
So that
couldn't
natural
construct.
pool is lined?
The pool has to be lined. And as far as the wastewater, it's going to drop down to the groundwater, which is much lower than the bottom of this pond, much lower.
Thank you.
The only thing natural about it is they put plants in it.
I just can't see an accessory in an accessory. It doesn't fly with me.
But that's just semantics.
No. I can see how this can be abused.
They could have
Yeah.
called it 2 primary structures on 1 lot, and then that would have worked.
Yeah.
That's just a label, isn't it?
No, I mean, how can you have 2 separate primary structures?
Because they're pre-existing
I
non-conforming.
understand that, but I'm looking at future, what people come in the future. What's gonna prevent somebody from building something like this from scratch?
Nothing. They're doing
Right.
it.
Right. So are we gonna allow somebody to, if they have the square footage in a primary house, to build a garage or a barn big enough that could accommodate 2 accessory units?
Or what if they have a garage or a barn and it's already there? And they
So
just,
we're gonna allow 2 accessory units in
no,
it?
we can't have where's the 2 accessory
Well,
units?
there's 2 accessory units here,
Could I answer
and,
that?
and a primary. I see this as the primary, this is an accessory with an accessory.
Okay,
So,
I see that too, when you say it that way.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Leary, in response to your question, somebody wouldn't be able to do this now because the zoning bylaw only allows 1 dwelling unit per lot. So they would not be allowed to build this accessory structure with a dwelling unit in it as well as an accessory apartment. They would be allowed to reconstruct or build a house and then have an accessory structure such as a barn or a garage with an accessory apartment in it. But they would not be able to do this today because this second dwelling unit is grandfathered because of the pre-1959 status. But if you look at the definition of the accessory apartment in your bylaw, it says an additional dwelling unit subordinate in size and accessory to the principal dwelling unit on the lot, which we have, located in either the principal dwelling or an accessory structure on the lot. So this is an accessory structure. The fact that it also has a dwelling in it is not prohibited in the bylaw.
But what's preventing someone to say, well, these are both primary residences?
Because our zoning bylaw doesn't have a definition of principal dwelling. We don't say what is a principal dwelling. We say principal structure because of the size of it, but we're not focusing on the use of the building in those definitions. And this is what Tom and I discussed today, because I was trying to wrap my head around it as well in terms of how to present it to you, because it is so unusual. But if you look at the bylaw, in the definition in 240.13, we define principal structure and we defined accessory structure. And those definitions are not based on use, but they're based on floor area and size. So in the accessory apartment bylaw, now all of a sudden we have the term principal dwelling. Well, where did that come from? I mean, to me, that's kind of a gap in the drafting. We should be consistent in principal structure, accessory structure, but we're not. But my point is that this still fits within the definition of an accessory apartment, notwithstanding that this accessory structure also has a grandfathered dwelling in it.
So it's a loophole.
It's a loophole.
Yeah.
But again, that's a loophole that the Zoning Board of Appeals is going to have to try and figure out if they're going to allow that or not. The Planning Board, I don't think, has to get into that loophole
No.
because you're doing site and design review.
I'm okay with the site review in the building.
Oh, yeah, the
I
building
think-
is
and I
fine.
think-
Yeah,
And I'm
I
okay
mean,
with the size. I haven't been able to embrace the whole thing, but it may not be our call. I mean, that's gonna be for the ZBA to decide this, but I think I'm getting it. There's 2 units on the site, well, now, and they're pre-existing. So you're starting over, and you have the right to keep them there, and by the way, you wanna put an accessory apartment in one of them.
Where's the kitchen?
I think I'm understanding it.
Right.
Yeah, I don't have a problem.
John?
I'm okay with 3 residential dwellings on 4.5 acres. I have no problem with that. Then we have a little display earlier tonight about.
I don't have a problem
About
with that.
density.
Did you see it?
John, I don't have a problem with that. It's the precedent that we're
Right,
setting.
we're gonna be dealing,
Because sure enough, somebody is gonna figure out a way that we're not gonna like.
but in order to do that, Bob, they would have to have a pre-existing non-conforming use with two units on it.
Look what we've had just recently come before us.
I know.
You know, an accessory apartment with a garage. I mean, this is the stuff that we're getting.
Right, but that was,
And people,
that was an empty piece of land, and they didn't
Yeah.
have the right to do it.
right, well, but this is what we're getting.
I just think that going down the road, that we're gonna have to really relook this, because this could be pretty prevalent. I mean, I drove through Penzance, and I looked at those mega structures with accessory buildings
Did you
to
go by the
them.
guard station, they didn't stop you?
No, I just said I was casing the joint.
Blew the gate at
And they
98.
said, come on in. There was actually no one there. But I mean, I do think that down the road, and I'm hoping that the ZBA will take a hard look at this, but I think zoning-wise, we're gonna have to really be very cautious if it is not a pre-existing. So you're just gonna create I mean, I love the idea of having a permanent caretaker. You know, I'm sure other people do as well, but probably a portion of the main house. Because I think of a caretaker in the distance between these 2 properties. And who knows? You know, I mean, I don't think that's, doesn't matter. Just, I could just go on and
Yes.
on.
I don't think we have to worry about prevalence, because there aren't that many lots in Falmouth this size. It'd be hard to put together. There aren't that many individuals who could afford to do this. I don't think this is going to become prevalent, and we actually stated that we wanted to do workforce housing. We just didn't think of it this way. But it is not contrary to what we've written. And John's comment is really quite true. Why would there be a problem with this density on this lot? There isn't.
It isn't the density.
It's not the density.
That's not.
That's what is,
Yeah.
the number of units on,
That's not.
on this
I think
size of the
If we
thing.
try to embrace neighborhood character, I think we're gonna be all right. Because this is the neighborhood's loaded with giant homes.
Right.
You got any advice for us? This is a tough one.
No, without being coy, when
The pond?
the pond. When I first looked at this, I had the same reaction everybody else did. I think I said, wow. But it gets down to, it's an 800 square foot accessory structure, accessory apartment, in a building that qualifies for that 800 square foot based on the merits of the second house. So it is subordinate to the first house on the front of the property. It is clearly subordinate to the 21,000 square foot house on the property. It's 800 square feet, the numbers work, the math works. I don't think anybody has to worry about somebody cheating on the percentages.
No, I don't either.
But it is one of those things, and to everyone else's point, if you've got a pre-existing structure, you've got two houses on a site from the 1920s, you're green-lighted for something like this. The difference here, and the thing that I asked Ms. Moynihan about, is are the residents gonna be living here year-round? Because I know there's a lot of people who would probably love a caretaker's house because they're only here for 2 weeks out of the year. But under our current bylaw, they can't do that unless they are residents of the town for that period of time.
It's like we required residents of 7 months.
Right. So provided we get an affidavit.
Affidavit that says that, it's ticking everything on the list. This wasn't envisioned, this, something this big. Any further comment or discussion from anybody?
Can I be the caretaker?
I thought about applying for the job myself. So what's the next step, Bob?
I will, if the board so instructs me, I will prepare a motion for approval site plan that will transmit to the building inspector and to the zoning board of appeals.
Okay,
She said this was the
oh, on the checklist, it says it was missing something, but that came in today.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Not his son.
He died.
All
so his
right.
wife owned it. His wife died.
Moving on, thank you very much. That was quite
Thank
a
you, and thank you for your,
challenge to embrace there. I
Yeah,
had a
yeah.
hard time with it.
and thank you for your patience in that. Appreciate it.
Structure just. What are their names?
George and Cynthia, no, something with Cynthia.
Applicant Jerry Rogers, site plan review to construct a storage building at 689 Gifford Street. This isn't it.
Stuff missing. Jerry Rogers, yeah.
You know what I don't see? Do we have elevations of this building? They should be there. Okay, there they are. We have seen those before. That's not that fancy. That's
My best friend.
I hope to win a
the
lot
garage,
there
right? The
and
storage room.
Have one just like it.
Okay, for the applicant, who do we have here?
Astounding.
Good evening. My name is Jerry Rogers. I'm the owner of Falmouth Self-Storage at 689 Gifford Street. I am here proposing a 4,900 square foot footprint, which would be actually 3 floors at the rear of the property at 689 Gifford Street. That has been, which is this area right back in here. It is now, or has been designated as a paved area for budget truck rental. I am finding more of a need for storage than I am for truck rental. And I am looking to take that paved area and put the building on it. So it doesn't upset my lot coverage and so forth and so on. I've been working with Tom. I believe that you have all the updated information regarding the site plan and so forth, which was just redone by Warwick Associates. The building would be, how do I move this around here?
Here it is. Agricultural zone.
Okay. All right, perfect. Okay. The new building will resemble the existing one in regard to peak height and eve height. It'll be the same color, same design. It is located in the right rear corner of the property facing the existing building. After watching the previous two presentations, I feel totally unmanned. So, and I'm a Red Sox fan.
Yes, I know.
Let's see. Uh-oh. This is just a elevation that was done by the architect, just showing the color and so forth. The red doors, which are in the front of this building as well. We've, working with Tom, we've addressed the drainage calculations. You know, it hasn't been determined exactly how we're going to handle that yet, but there has been, I don't know what you've gotten back from engineering regarding that. There is an issue that was brought up regarding access by the fire department. This here is a loading dock, and the fire department was concerned about getting their bigger trucks around and out, and especially through this area. So, you know, we decided that we could actually remove that loading dock and pave it. Very honestly, it doesn't get used. All of the big vans and so forth that come in now, they lower down, they have ramps that they use, so it's really a moot point to have that there. I think it's a positive move in regard to the area. The trucks are the trucks. We all know what happens with those. They leak, they bleed, they're parked there and so forth. This is a much cleaner, neater operation in the big scheme of things. It'll cut down a little bit on the traffic in the area and so forth. When the engineer went out, we're addressing a curb cut that was left open. I talked to Lawrence and Lynch. I have a proposal that they gave me to come and replace that. It's a pretty straightforward project. There's no change of use or anything of the sort.
Tom, is the use an approved use in the AGB zoning district?
It is, and it exists there currently.
It's already there, so we're not making any non-conformities, it's all. Charlotte, any comments?
I'm looking at this memo from Tom, dated this past September 20th, so a very recent memo, and noted several conditions from previous site plan approval that don't appear to have been, are these still of concern?
Those are the things that Mr. Rogers was just saying they'll be addressing. When we got the site plan in and we looked at what the site plan was approved, when engineering went out to the site, they didn't see some of those previously approved conditions. So the board in their decision, I'm hoping will say to ensure that the project complies with all previous approvals. This project originally went to the Cape Cod Commission as a development of regional impact. It came back as approved through that. We've had some conversations with the Cape Cod Commission about whether this change evokes another return to the commission. They said it did not because it was an incremental change. So though a couple of the conditions where the sidewalk wasn't carried through, where the curbing was supposed to be replaced, our engineering department went out there and noted where these issues weren't at, and they'll have to be rectified as part of before they get a certificate of occupancy in the conversations we've had with the building inspector.
So you're suggesting that we would give it a site plan approval conditioned on those, bringing it into compliance?
Correct. And as far as the site itself goes, we have an area where there's parking for trucks. That area will be replaced with a building. That building will take clean storm water off the roof and put it into the drainage versus, the runoff from trucks and things like that. My opinion, and confirmed by the Cape Cod Commission's review in our discussions, was that this will likely bring less traffic to the site because people aren't coming here to rent a large truck and bring it back and then park it where they tend to get parked at now, which is not necessarily where things were designed to have trucks parked at. After hours, they don't have a key, whatever, the truck stays outside. So replacing the parking with a building provides a number of benefits, from cleaner stormwater, increased tax base, shorter number of trips, and frankly, it works for the site. I know there's abutters here on the meeting as well, have been very patient listening to everything else. They may have some comments and concerns about it. But from our perspective, it looks like it's easily a use that can fit onto the site, has a number of improvements for the site. And if we approve the site plan, it will be conditioned on current conditions as well as rectifying any past conditions. And then we'll be sending this to the Zoning Board of Appeals for their approval of the use.
Before I open up to the public, any other board members?
I just think it's a positive change.
Anybody from the public like to speak? Please come up, identify yourself.
Good evening, my name is David Pius. I live at 701 Gibbon Street, right next door. Mr. Rogers has been a great neighbor since he got rid of the junkyard, which was a wonderful thing a long time ago. Only issues I've had with the budget trucks is, it's not the trucks, it's the people. You can't control what they do, what time of hours they come in. So this would be a wonderful thing. I mean, I'm not complaining about the trucks, but sometimes people come in at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, drop them off wherever they want, make all kind of noise, and they leave. I mean, that's not his fault, that's just the way people are, but he's a great neighbor. I think it's a great project for that area there, and like you said, get rid of the trucks, there'll be less, oil or what have you, any kind of problems like that, so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
No?
So there is one remaining technical issue we're working out on the drainage calculations as well. It's just a technical sort of thing that we'll be reviving. And by the time we're back to vote on this, we should have those technical issues on the drainage sort of.
All outstanding site plan issues from the previous thing will be taken care of.
Absolutely.
That's going to be in this decision.
Absolutely.
I agree.
Including removing the ramp so the fire truck can get around.
Yeah, that has to be done.
Which they
too.
can't get around
It
now,
doesn't
so.
work without that. The fire is,
So-
I'm not going to override the fire department. They said, can't get by.
I'm
Your
not
business
going
has
to
changed, you
either.
don't need it now. Different type of use, right?
It really is. It was a moot point. It never should have been put in the original project. So I have no issue whatsoever taking it out.
Okay. I'll be looking forward to a draft motion then.
Very well.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, folks, planning board discussion.
So we have another applicant there.
Do we? Yep, we do,
Yeah,
sorry.
the town
Oh, jeez.
parking spaces.
We've got a motion.
We've got a motion all set, ready to go, right?
Yes.
Want to read it, or you want Bob to? How's your voice?
Look it out.
let Pat get started, you stand by. If she starts coughing, you're backup.
Not official, Miss Budget. Yeah.
Okay, site plan review application for Town of Falmouth, 744 Main Street, map number 3921001000. I move that, nope, excuse me, motion. At its meeting of October 9, 2018, the planning board voted to approve the application of the Town of Falmouth under Article 39, site plan review of the zoning bylaw for a plan entitled Site Plan Review Parking Plan 744 Main Street, prepared by Tetra Tech, Inc., dated September 25, 2017, revised October 5, 2017, scale 1 inch equals 40 feet, 4 sheets, with the following findings, recommendations, and conditions. Findings. The planning board in 1987 issued a site plan review special permit under a predecessor bylaw for this location, 744 Main Street, pursuant to the construction of the Gus Canty Recreation Center. In part, this decision approved the design and the number of parking spaces allocated to the buildings on site, including the recreation center, the Edward Marks Building, in parentheses, Poor House. By the way, he hated that.
I know.
And the Falmouth Police, including the recreation, and the Falmouth Police Department. A parking reduction was also granted to allow a total of 150 spaces to be designated for use for the activities associated with the recreation center, instead of the 200 that would have been required under the zoning bylaw. The board conditioned its decision that any changes to the plans would need to be approved by a successor board. Accordingly, the previous site plan review application and decision dated October 25, 2017, for a plan entitled Site Plan Review Parking Plan 744 Main Street, prepared by Tetra Tech, Inc., dated September 25, 2017, revised October 5, 2017, sought to reconfigure and reconstruct the parking, circulation, curb cuts, and the attendant drainage, lighting, and landscaping for the current and the proposed buildings on the site under the current site plan review bylaw. The intent of the improvements to the parking and circulation shown on the amended plan cited above is to accommodate the proposed senior center as well as improve the existing conditions. The board found that the redesign of the curb cut and driveway serving the police department was a vast improvement over existing conditions, as well as the proposed access to the recreation center, which is showing an expanded curb cut at Scranton Avenue and a proposed exit onto Dillingham Avenue. Circulation is better defined with Granite Island's crosswalks, a drop-off area, and directional signing. Lighting will be enhanced for the parking field and drainage will be improved to today's standards. Handicap parking is being expanded, and an area dedicated to employee parking and deliveries is proposed. The board found these and the other improvements shown on the plan acceptable, subject to the recommendations and conditions contained herein. On October 24, 2017, the planning board issued site plan review recommendations, referenced below, being fully aware that the number of parking spaces available dictated the design of the proposed senior center. The board offered the following recommendations in the October 25, 2017 decision, knowing that the design process was still ongoing and subject to refinement as plans progress. Recommendations: 1, pedestrian access from the parking field to the Gov. Fuller athletic fields should be better defined as the plans for the proposed senior center progress. 2, a turnaround for vehicles entering the police department driveway in error should be provided. 3, deterring cut-through traffic from Dillingham Avenue in the form of a gate or similar control structure should be considered. 4, additional lighting should be provided in the area designated for employee parking and deliveries. All lighting on the site should be designed as downlighting. 5, the existing sidewalk along the easterly property line should be extended to the athletic fields. 6, coordination of on-site activities during and after construction with Commodore and high school football programs is highly recommended. 7, handicap parking may want to be grouped behind the proposed senior center to jointly serve the building and the activities at the athletic fields. 8, angled parking adjacent to the senior and recreation centers should be considered given the users of either facility may be below the 80th percentile in driverability. 9, public parking serving the police station is absent and needs to be provided either from these approved plans or elsewhere on site. 10, roof drainage from the existing recreation and proposed senior center buildings should be incorporated into the future design program. On September 10, 2018, the town of Falmouth submitted an amended application for site plan review as per condition 1 of the October 25, 2017 site plan decision. The revised plans referenced above include the fully developed senior center building foundation layout with associated site improvements to accommodate the new building along with architectural elevations. The amended application and plans include the following changes. The curb cut for the one-way right turn onto the site off of Main Street was shifted to be entirely on the Gus Canty/Senior Center site. The front drop-off row will have a one-way circulation pattern with parking for this aisle to be angled and will comply with ADA requirements. Curb cut at Dillingham shifted to be entirely on the Gus Canty/Senior Center site. Installation of enhanced drainage at the proposed employee parking located to the rear of the lot toward Dillingham Avenue. The inclusion of the proposed senior center building with associated drainage. The board reviewed the plans and expressed concern that the revisions did not include a defined crosswalk within the parking field from the rear of the lot to the proposed senior center building. The board requested the addition of a crosswalk to the center double parking aisle from the rear of parking field to a curb cut located in front of the proposed senior center. Conditions. 1, the plan shall be constructed as approved. Any changes shall be reviewed by the planning board to determine if a modification of this decision is necessary. Pursuant to section 240-183B of the zoning bylaw, no permit for full or partial occupancy shall be issued until the planning board is satisfied that the conditions of this approval and predecessor approvals have been met. 2, the addition of a crosswalk at the center double parking aisle from the rear parking field to a curb cut located in front of the proposed senior center. We need a second.
And if I may, on the screen, you see the inclusion of that pedestrian walkway that the board had requested.
Wonderful. Need a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Okay,
So that was 6-1-0?
6-1.
6-1.
6-1.
Moving on, planning board discussion committee reports.
Can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
Can we defer this to the next meeting?
Yeah,
Particularly since the Red Sox are ahead
Absolutely.
2-1 in the second inning?
somebody second that? All in favor?
Aye.
Motion to close?
Oh, we don't have that yet because we have general
General
correspondence.
Okay.
Unless we want to avoid that till next time too.
No, I just have some quick comments.
Okay, go ahead.
On Mr. Walker's letter, he talks about that solar energy systems should be exempted from setback, building height, and roof and lot coverage restrictions. I am not in favor of that. And creating an easement to sunlight over neighboring property, I just don't see how that can fly.
Actually, I think this is out of order. Mr. Walker chose to speak.
Right.
Things are not on our agenda. I
Well-
guess we probably shouldn't have let him done that because
Well, this is correspondence.
But this is
correspondence.
correspondence.
Yeah, it's kind of
So-
getting it onto the agenda, though.
So, but I just think that's a bad idea, because zoning is there to protect all property owners, and I don't see where one property owner has more rights than another, whereas they could essentially ask you to cut down trees to give them solar access. I just don't think that's right. And set the building height and the buffer zones and all that, they're designed to protect property owners, so I don't think that's something we should endorse.
I'm happy with the setbacks that we thought through, that we did what we thought was good for Falmouth, not necessarily.
Well, I'd also like to point out that it's kind of too late to change any of
Oh, I
these
know.
warrant
Yeah.
articles at
Right.
this point.
But you
so
never know on town meeting floor.
Well, you
I
can try.
understand.
That's,
You can try. Yep.
I know we took down a lot of trees for solar panels, and that was up to us, but that was our decision.
And just as a plug, if I may, the League of Women Voters will have a forum on November 1st at the Herman Room to discuss the zoning articles. We provided them some information, and I will be attending that meeting as well to help with any questions they might have.
They're gonna be discussing all the zoning articles.
All the zoning articles. But the invitation says specifically solar and the other articles as well.
Jim?
Yes.
I would like to thank, and I think we should thank him for having written the letter, giving us his opinions and making it part of the conversation the whole community is having, so that it's out there and can be fully thought through. It happens that I agree very much with what Bob said, but I'm very glad to see this in writing and out there for people to think about, so thank you.
Yep. Nope. Nope. You're out of order. You're not recognized.
We should explain that this is correspondence, it's not for
Yeah,
general
correspondence is
discussion.
not an issue. We gave you your 2 minutes.
Okay, move to adjourn?
Whoa, we got the other item here,
What is there?
future agenda items.
We can dispose of the,
Okay, want to pick it up next time?
we picked it up next time. That was voted on and seconded and all set.
Well, what was voted on was
Yep,
the
we're done.
planning board discussion, not the
We need to
general.
go home and
Motion
watch
to-
the Red Sox, right?
A motion is not debatable. We're done.
Well, that was not the motion.
Yes, it was. I heard Bob say motion to close,
yeah.
and we're done.
Motion to adjourn.
That's done.
The motion was only on the planning board discussion, not on.
I think it's 7 o'clock. I'll look it up.
Go, right?